Hi everyone, please subscribe to my channel. Blood Immortal Venerable. See playlist for other chapters and novels. I do not translate the novels. Credits goes to original translator and author of the novel. I only make it as an audiobook so it would be easier to just listen while doing other things. Credits goes to the author of the novel. I convert stories to audiobook for mental health, for multitasking purpose, for accessibility and time saving. Listening to audiobook is also beneficial for people who have disability. It improves our listening skills and improve our English comprehension, vocabulary and other things. So, thank you for listening. Thank you and thank you very much for your support. Chapter 2821, Champion Fish and Smoke Wall. It was said that a soul was as light as a feather. It drifted anywhere, wherever the wind went. However, the same rule did not apply in the other shore. Souls of light were heavy. They didn't have the ability to float and fly. Warriors needed a boat to simply cross the sea of truth. When the soul-binding threads spread all over an area, it meant that people would move very slowly in that area. The disciples of the Oneness Sky Palace eagerly wanted to return to the temple to wait for the effect of the soul-binding threads to disappear and then they could leave the other shore. Zen and Dorothy were moving swiftly through the crowd, unaffected by the soul-binding threads at their feet. Despite his seeming confidence, Zen was wary that something bad was going to happen. The bearing race was making bold moves. They even used soul crystal as bait. Seamus wouldn't let go of them easily. By the time Zen and Dorothy, leading the crowd, had rushed 3,000 to 4,000 feet, shadows of altars appeared in the distance. The altars had steps. They were roughly the size of a house and looked a little unsophisticated. Zen squinted his eyes to investigate the altars better. He was clueless as to what those altars were for. Fortunately, the elite disciples of the Oneness Sky Palace knew better. They all muttered a gasp of recognition. Champion fish. These are the champion fish altars. Where did they get so many champion fish altars? There are at most 10 odd of them in the stage 12 of other shore. But here, there must be over 100 of them. Altars nearly encircled every inch of the arena. What is champion fish altar? Zen asked with a frown. Although Dorothy had an indigo soul, she also had a similarly limited experience as Zen when it came to the other shore. Luckily, she had heard of champion fish. The champion fish is a common creature living in the other shore. They like gathering inside altars. A huge sea of sand covered stage 12. Within its vicinity, temples of more than 10 greatest races stood. Almost all of these temples required another shore key to enter. Only the champion fish temple did not. One could simply come and go as they pleased. However, it was a very dangerous place. It posed greater risks than stage 13. Warriors who had entered the champion fish temple were rumored to have gone downhill. It was common practice for the warriors to avoid the temple altogether. Now, the bearing race had moved so many champion fish altars from stage 12 of other shore here. No one could figure out how they did it. The elites of the Oneness Sky Palace who had been in the champion fish temple were scared. They knew how scary it was and they trembled at the sight of the altars. Rush over, Zen ordered without any hesitation. All right, Dorothy said with determination. They knew that the longer they stayed, the more vulnerable they became. That was another attempt to get rid of them. They had no choice but to fight head-on. When Zen and Dorothy were about 1,000 feet away from the altars, a mirror suddenly appeared on each of the altars. Fish that looked like carps with thick scales could be seen in the mirrors. On their backs, a pair of wide wings fluttered and tusks were contained in their mouths. When the mirrors appeared, fish leapt out until there were more than 10 of them on each altar. The champion fish was a creature living within stage 12. They were formidable and terrifying creatures, especially in groups. The warriors gasped in horror. Even the strongest among them trembled with fear, much more those only in the 4th or 5th stage of the other shore realm. Whoosh, whoosh, whoosh. A handful of champion fish hurled themselves towards Zen. Zen squinted his eyes. He rolled over and, with a flick of his wrist, purple light beamed from his hand. His fingers transformed into 5 sharp thorns which allowed him to stab each of the fish that came his way. Bang. Blocked. Zen looked mortified. It turned out a different technique was needed to approach the fish. They were different from the soul snakes they had previously fought. The soul snakes were much easier to deal with for someone like Zen and Dorothy. Swoosh, swoosh, swoosh. A champion fish made contact with Zen's prickly finger and flopped to the ground. However, in just a matter of seconds, it quickly bounced up and flapped its wings with full momentum. It seemed unfazed by Zen's attacks. Go to perdition. A fierce light flashed in Zen's eyes. His body flashed with purple light. Above him, a white energy cyclone hovered. Mind sword. Milo's heart-slaughtering strike might be powerful, and he was far more proficient in it than Zen. But heart-slaughtering strike's power depended on the strength of the warrior's soul of light. As Zen had an indigo soul now, the invisible mind sword became more powerful than Milo's heart-slaughtering strike. With a swift wave of Zen's mind sword, some of the champion fish erupted into pieces. Seamus had been observing everything from the back of the soul arena. His eyes widened at the sight of Zen using the mind sword. He thought Milo was already powerful. He did not expect someone else to come forward with the unique ability. However, Zen was proving himself to be more powerful than Milo. Seamus made a mental note of what he had seen. He knew this was golden information he had to report to his superiors. The power of the invisible mind sword was far beyond the scope of a soul of light's ability in the lust world. You're capable, so what, you'll still end up dead today, Seamus sneered. He then ordered his men, ask the divine farmer race to kill them. Nobody will be spared. Plenty of people from the divine farmer race stood as part of the audience. Their presence had long been part of the plan. After Seamus had given the orders, pink seeds emerged from the edge of the area covered by the soul-binding threads. Slowly, the seeds sprouted. Soon, they were going to bear fruits. As soon as that happened, the fruits withered and started to smoke. The divine farmer race were good at making pills and poison. But the smoke wasn't poison. The smoke curtains created a special enchanted barrier. When the curtains of smoke reached a few hundred feet above ground, members from the divine farmer race said in unison, "Condense." The smoke did as ordered. It condensed into a solid round wall that entrapped the disciples within it. On the other side, Zen was occupied battling the champion fish. Together with Dorothy, they had killed at least 40 of those fish. They were surprised to see the weird wall block their way as they reached the altars. Shatter. Zen's mind activated. His mind sword stabbed the wall of smoke. The mind sword successfully pierced it, but, to Zen's dismay, it wasn't able to fully penetrate it. There was something strange with the wall. No matter how hard Zen tried, he could not break it. Chapter 2822, Predicament. As Zen tried to destroy the smoke wall, several champion fish rushed towards him secretly. They had begun to open their mouths, ready to bite into Zen's body when a small sword pierced through them, cutting all of them into pieces. "Be careful, Zen," Dorothy warned, concerned. Dorothy was keeping an eye on Zen's surroundings while he concentrated on destroying the wall. "This wall is too strong. It's too difficult to destroy," Zen said, frowning. They could neither break through the wall, nor leave the other shore. A constant stream of champion fish kept emerging from the altars. This was a dead end for the disciples of the Oneness Sky Palace. The champion fish could not hurt Zen, but the other disciples were in great trouble. The champion fish shot out of the altars from all directions and charged at the disciples of the Oneness Sky Palace. The bearing race and the divine farmer race seemed to have used some special method that caused the champion fish to ignore them. One of the weaker disciples was slower than the others in his escape and soon found himself surrounded by a large group of champion fish. Before he could react, the malicious creatures had torn his soul of light apart. He screamed in pain, desperate for relief, as his soul was mercilessly ripped into shreds. But his scream only lasted 3 seconds before the champion fish ate up his soul. As more and more disciples met the same fate, their pathetic screams echoed across the place from time to time. It was like witnessing the worst kind of torture on earth as the champion fish devoured the souls of light of the poor disciples. Quite a few elites of the Oneness Sky Palace were present, and all of them, including Milo, could protect only themselves. "There's no point in going on like this," Zen muttered, as the number of champion fish swelled. He climbed onto an altar and roared, raising his voice through his soul power, "All disciples of the Oneness Sky Palace, please stay close to me." The disciples of the Oneness Sky Palace heeded his words and began to move towards him. Zen had been charging forward at the front, the rest following him in a loose formation. At his summons, the elite disciples gathered together tightly, trying to keep as close to him as possible. The weaker disciples were at the center, surrounded and protected by the others, while the indigo souls who were capable of fighting the champion fish remained in the outer circle. They stayed close to each other, their backs against the edges of the altars. The champion fish kept coming at them with a ferocity that was unmatched. But the moment they made it near the crowd, the disciples' joint attacks succeeded in killing them. "Don't panic. Stand your ground. We have the power to fight against these fish. Let's fight the bearing race to death since they didn't allow us to leave." Now that they were out of danger, the elite disciples calmed down quickly and began to encourage their companions. They soon managed to erase their fears and regain their confidence to fight. "Zen, let me help you," a man shouted, jumping onto the altar that Zen was standing on. Zen recognized the man's voice. Connor, I didn't know you were here. Zen said, surprised. I only came here as a spectator. I didn't expect things to take such a turn, Connor grumbled. Most disciples of the Oneness Sky Palace had come here out of curiosity. It was possible that some of them wanted to acquire the soul crystal of the bearing race. Zen had neither the time nor the mood to listen to Connor's complaints. Now that so many disciples had gathered around him, he hoped that they could think up a way to destroy the smoke wall. He said, this wall of smoke is proving difficult to destroy. If any of you have an idea of how to deal with it, please come and have a try. Zen had tried all the tricks in his book until a few moments ago. His mind sword was sharp and powerful, but he hadn't been able to make a single dent in the wall. These elite disciples came from different mountains in the Oneness Sky Palace, and they all cultivated different types of theurgies. Zen hoped that some of them might have practiced powerful soul theurgies that could destroy the wall. Saying thus, Zen jumped off the altar and made his way to the outer circle to help the other elite disciples kill the champion fish. Let me do it. A man flew out of the crowd and came to stand on the altar. It's Ephraim, the best of talents from the Azure Mountain. His power is on par with Milo's, and his cultivation base is even higher than Milo's. As the crowd hissed with excitement and gazed up at him in awe, purple flames began to appear on the surface of Ephraim's soul. His soul of light seemed to be burning. He slapped both hands onto the wall, causing the peculiar purple flames to climb the wall, lapping fiercely against it. This purple flame was a soul skill unique to the Azure Mountain. Disciples could rarely grasp it. Fiery as the purple flames were, they had almost no effect on the wall. They just paled slightly in color. There was no sign of any substantial damage at all. Ephraim tried a number of times, but when he saw that he was making no difference, he shook his head helplessly and jumped off the altar. I can't destroy this wall, he said with a sigh. Let me try. And me. The elite disciples of the Oneness Sky Palace took turns to try their luck with the wall, displaying their unique skills in the process. Zen killed the champion fish as they charged at him, but he also had an eye on what was going on behind him. He couldn't help but feel disappointed at the various soul theurgies that his companions were using. The Oneness Sky Palace had a serious disadvantage. It was one of the three orthodox forces of the human race, but it was in fact a union of a number of clans. The 7 mountains were separated from each other and each had their own set of systems. They were not merged together as one whole. On the other hand, the Bearing race and the Divine Farmer race both consisted only of members from the same race, who shared bloodlines with each other. They had had the advantage of strong cohesion on many occasions before, an advantage that the Oneness Sky Palace would never be able to acquire. The elite disciples who had the confidence to destroy the wall took turns trying their luck with the wall. But every single one of them ended up failing. We can't break this wall. What should we do now? We can't just sit around trapped in this place, right? As they spiraled into desperate discussions, the champion fish continued to emerge from the altars and rain down on them. They had gathered all their strength and killed a number of champion fish. But their soul power was limited. They could still consume soul pills to replenish their power, but they would eventually use up all of the pills if they couldn't manage to find a way out. They would all die even if they were to guard themselves while staying put. Why don't we try to destroy the altars instead? Someone piped up suddenly. The altars that the Bearing race had summoned had fully materialized by now. Dorothy and a few others stepped gingerly onto some of them. If any champion fish were to fly out of the altars, they could immediately kill them from where they stood. There were over 100 altars here. If they could destroy all of them, they might still have a chance of surviving. I don't think it's that easy, Dorothy said skeptically. The necklace of mystic soul hanging on her chest flashed and a soul sword that had been floating beside, shot fiercely towards an altar. Ding, but the small sword merely bounced away with a clanging sound. These altars were almost as strong as the temples, which was why they were unable to break them. A few other disciples tried to have a go after Dorothy, but ended up with the same result. Zen frowned at this disappointing sight, wondering what else they could do. If his soul of light could get out of the other shore and he then returned with his physical body, he believed that he could destroy these altars. But if he could get out of the other shore, it meant that the others could do just the same. This would no longer be a predicament to them. Splash! The champion fish in the distance were swirling and spiraling upwards into the air, forming a protecting layer around a soul of light. Seamus. You're still under the illusion that you have a chance of survival, aren't you? Seamus said, smiling. Let me break the illusion for you and turn you into feed for these champion fish. He had barely finished talking when a faint golden light flashed across the mirrors on all the altars. The champion fish emerging from the mirrors grew several times in size. Chapter 2823, Impulse. Studying the champion fish whose size was exceedingly bigger than before, all the disciples of the Oneness Sky Palace lost their ability to speak. Never having encountered such a situation, they stood with their feet rooted to the ground. "I'll go kill him," Milo blurted out abruptly, breaking the death-like silence. Even though everyone knew they were caught in a trap carefully designed by the Bearing race and the Divine Farmer race, the fact that Milo had blindly facilitated their plan could not be denied. The overwhelming pressure and guilt weighing down on his shoulders kept him silent from the beginning. He only had one thing on his mind, and it was to kill those champion fish to redeem himself. Witnessing Seamus act more and more rashly, Milo could not just stand by and watch anymore. Seamus was the source of all problems. He was obviously the one who was controlling the altars and the champion fish like some puppeteer. Apart from destroying the altars and breaking the wall to escape, killing Seamus could be an alternative way. However, it would still pose a challenge due to him being guarded by several layers of champion fish. "Don't be impulsive, Milo. You'll jeopardize everything. Seamus must have taken all necessary preventive measures against us today." Connor and the others tried to calm him down by reasoning with him. But it was to no avail. Milo shook off all their pleas as he clenched his fists, a cold aura beginning to emit from his soul of light. Even though Milo was arrogant, he was still a level-headed person. Ever since he went up the mountain, not once did he lose his cool over anything. But now, it seemed Seamus had stepped over his last nerve and driven him off the edge of sanity. Swish! Milo's figure flashed at the speed of light as they all watched him charge towards Seamus without any hint of hesitation. "No, Milo, stop, he's heading to his death. Somebody stop him. Who can get him back?" The disciples of the Oneness Sky Palace erupted in frustration as they all screamed in unison. No matter how strong Milo was, there was no way he could survive the besiege laid by the countless champion fish. Whoosh! Someone else was seen heading in the same direction as Milo from the crowd. While the person rushed forward, he left a series of purple flames behind from his steps. Ephraim, what are you doing?" Judging from his speed and determination, it did not seem like he went on a rescue mission to get Milo back. But, he was going to assist Milo in his attempt to kill Seamus. "Staying here is like inviting death to consume us all. Instead of waiting for our end, why don't we just fight for our lives?" That was all Ephraim said to the disciples who tried to stop him. Those who were strong enough to stand out from others in the Oneness Sky Palace were by no means afraid of going face to face with death. Both Ephraim and Milo had gone through their fair share of life and death situations. And neither of them shied away from making desperate decisions when faced with challenging circumstances. "I'll go too." Zen's figure began to flash as he prepared to charge towards Seamus as well. "Zen, wait," Dorothy shouted desperately from afar. "What is it?" Zen hesitated to turn to look at her. "Please, be careful." Dorothy was worried about him, but she didn't stop him. They would have a less chance of survival if both Milo and Ephraim died. If they really wanted to kill Seamus today, their best bet would be to cooperate and launch their mightiest strike together. Whoosh, whoosh. Following their lead, another pair of warriors emerged from the crowd with determination. Both of them were indigo souls. They were outstanding warriors coming from the Ivory Mountain and the Bright Mountain, respectively. Seeing the 5 tenacious figures approach him with agility, Seamus put on a smug smile. The desperate rabbits will bite. What a pity, they all seem to be courting death. With a gentle gesture of his hand, he pointed at Milo, who was in the lead. In response to his command, the champion fish swarmed over towards Milo like a gust of wind. Each of these fish was quite tough. Ordinary means of attack just wouldn't suffice in tearing their scales apart, and there were thousands of them. One on top of the other, they forged a thick wall and made their way towards Milo. Milo's young face was full of coldness, and the aura of his soul of light became colder, which could even be sensed by people from some distance away. "Do you honestly believe that these things can stop me?" Milo turned over, and his mind sword responded to his growing rage. It began to swirl around him crazily in frantic movements, like a blade of a windmill. Biff, 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 biff. Every champion fish that came within a 10-foot radius of Milo was brutally cut into pieces by his mind sword. He actually managed to power through the wall made of champion fish and charge towards Seamus. Seamus remained unfazed by this sight. He still had other moves up his sleeve. The army of champion fish he sent out at the beginning was small. He didn't pin his hopes on them to kill the elite disciples of the Oneness Sky Palace. But then, more champion fish of huge sizes came out of the altars and revealed themselves. Slowly, they stationed themselves behind Seamus as if they were the last layer of protection he had. These bigger ones were surely not easy to deal with. However, Seamus seemed to have overlooked one detail, and that was how fast Milo could move. Now in a state of sheer madness, Milo was out of control as he went all out to activate his soul force. It was as if his whole figure had morphed into a sharp blade, rushing to his target with incredible speed. Crack, crack, Ephraim, Zen, and the other two had broken through the wall of the champion fish and watched in shock at how fast Milo was advancing. The speed of Milo is amazing. How did he achieve that? He seems a little unnatural. The warriors on the other shore did not use their eyes to see. Instead, they used their souls to perceive things. Milo's soul grew more and more ruthless with time. His aura was bone-chilling cold like that of the Sea of Truth. Phew, not only did his increasing speed surpass the expectations of Zen and Ephraim, but Seamus was caught off guard as well. When Seamus regained his senses, Milo was already only 100 feet away from him. Not knowing how to deal with the situation, Seamus remained dumbfounded with his eyes fixated on Milo. Fear began to seize him as he felt himself give up. He was not strong enough to go against Milo if they were up against each other in a fair fight. And now, Milo was going all out rampaging towards him. How could Seamus be willing to risk his life fighting Milo? The only logical plan spiraling in his mind now was to retreat. Phew, however, he could never escape in time as Milo's speed far surpassed his. Soon, the distance between them had closed significantly. Zen, Ephraim, and the other two warriors quickly rushed over to watch the scene more closely. A glimmer of hope flashed through their hearts. Can he really do it? Can Milo kill Seamus and end it once and for all? They started to wonder to themselves. Mind Sword, Milo roared in aggravation as he unleashed a sharper aura than before. An invisible Mind Sword began to take its form in front of him. As the sword was about to kill Seamus, the ground beneath Milo's feet cracked open. Bang! A vine full of sharp teeth extended from the open ground and wrapped itself around Milo, restraining him. Meanwhile, Seamus, who was retreating, stopped in his tracks and began to laugh viciously. Surprised. Don't forget, I didn't come here alone. This trap was carefully planned. It was a joint work from the elite disciples of the Bearing race and Divine Farmer race. Seamus' job was only to control the champion fish. In remembrance to your bravery, I'll grant you a quick and painless death. Seamus gloated while waving his hands gently once more. Upon his command, the huge champion fish gathered from all directions and charged at Milo with an intent to kill. In the blink of an eye, Milo was surrounded with no place to retreat. No, Milo, no way, Milo, somebody, please go save him. The expressions of Ephraim, Zen, and the others switched immensely. If he fell into the mouth of these champion fish, his soul of light would be devoured within a split second. Milo might not be able to survive this. Chapter 2824, A Chance of Surviving. Ephraim was the first to rush over to where the huge champion fish were tangled together, knitted into a huge fish column. Zen followed closely behind. Milo was trapped in the middle of the column. Burn! Ephraim shouted. A sizzling noise rent the air. Purple soul flame had begun to burn intensely. Ephraim's soul flame was powerful. The huge champion fish had thick, rough skin, but under the soul flame's intensity, their twisting bodies were scorched black. Ephraim removed the charred corpses of the fish from the outer layer. But there were still a lot of fish inside. No one knew how many layers of fish had wrapped themselves around Milo. Zen was also working hard and trying his best to save Milo, but to no avail so far. Killing these fish was much more difficult than they had imagined. These were several times stronger than the smaller ones they had dealt with before. Even with his sharp mind sword, Zen had managed to kill only 6 of them. They looked at each other, their hearts sinking. It looked like Milo was going to die this time. They needed to be careful of the champion fish sneaking up on them while they tried to save Milo. What was more, they had to be cautious of the creepy vines that sprang suddenly out of the ground. Seamus had, in fact, intended to finish off Zen and the other 4 warriors who had come to attack him. He had sent only half the number of champion fish to attack the disciples of the Oneness Sky Palace. The other half kept gathering together, forming a huge circle. To Seamus, the guys who were rushing towards him were already dead. Zen suddenly felt a chill emanating from the column that the champion fish had formed. Ephraim was burning the champion fish with his soul flame, but it was extinguished the moment the chill began to spread outwards. It's so cold. This chill was 100 times more horrifying than that of the Sea of Truth. Even Zen and Ephraim who had indigo souls had to beat a retreat. The champion fish that formed the column wriggled madly, and only stopped moving when the chillness spread over them. It wasn't long before the entire column froze and became a solid, unmoving column. Crack, 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 cracks began to appear on the surface of the column, and those huge champion fish broke as well. Seamus looked at the column, confused. He could not figure out the kind of method that was used to freeze the champion fish so instantly. Seamus's puzzlement lasted just a moment before the fish column broke and shattered. The champion fish and the vines that had trapped Milo turned into pieces. A blue sharp sword radiance shot towards Seamus. This is the mind sword. But where did the chill come from? Zen wondered. The mind sword was originally colorless and invisible, but the chillness it contained was so strong that its energy manifested itself so that it outlined the originally invisible mind sword in a tinge of light blue. Seamus hadn't expected this to happen. He was stunned at the sudden surge of sword radiance coming his way. He took a deep breath before ducking out of the way in a bid to dodge the attack. The sword radiance brushed past Seamus's arm. His arm went numb, losing all sense of touch. The chill managed to injure his soul. Milo. The moment he had launched the strike, Milo fell from the sky onto the frozen corpses of the champion fish. Milo's soul was left incomplete from being trapped by the vines and bitten by the champion fish. His arms were gone, his torso ripped, and his soul had become badly damaged. But he was able to unleash a terrifyingly powerful strike even in this state. Ephraim and the others who had witnessed it were impressed by the braveness of the act. Zen didn't have time to check on Milo. It was obvious that Milo must have paid a huge price to be able to perform that strike and freeze the champion fish. But he missed his target and failed to kill Seamus. Zen caught sight of Seamus fleeing. He wasn't about to let go of this opportunity. He followed Seamus. Seamus calmed down after a short period of panicking. The champion fish obeyed his orders and this was his greatest advantage. As he spotted Zen following him, he waved a hand and the champion fish rushed to create a barrier between him and Zen. At the same time, a seed began to sprout from the ground under Zen. Milo's situation had become desperate after having been wrapped up in the vines that grew from the seed. Zen had learned his lesson from Milo and was on constant guard. The seed began to grow into vines and spread to Zen, but his mind sword turned downwards and chopped at the vines, cutting them in half. Zen was fast in his reactions but Seamus had already put quite some distance between himself and Zen. The number of champion fish coming Zen's way from all directions was increasing. They would surround him if he hesitated for even a moment. I'll escape from the right, he said to himself. Crack, 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 he killed several champion fish before he found it was pointless to continue chasing Seamus. He escaped the encirclement from the right. But the moment Zen found some breathing space, more champion fish emerged out of nowhere and began to chase him. You want to kill me? Go to perdition, Seamus yelled, turning his attention to Zen. Zen fought the fish off as he withdrew. But he only managed to dodge the fish a few times before he was cornered. Behind him was the wall formed by smoke. There was no way out of here. Zen frowned at the rapidly flapping wings of the champion fish, his jaw clenching. There were few tricks on the other shore that Zen could use to retaliate and he had fallen into a dead end this time. He had never thought he would find himself in such a sticky situation when all he wanted was to watch a fight. Whoosh, whoosh, whoosh. As the champion fish closed in on him, Zen continued to control his mind sword and brought it down in continuous strikes. But the number of champion fish that were killed was too small when compared to the ones still making their way towards him. Zen was just about to give up when a sudden chill went through him. What's that? A sword mark could be seen on the smoke wall. It was the mark left by Milo's strike. Cold blue air rose around the mark. The strike that Milo had launched with all his strength hadn't hit Seamus. Instead, it brushed past his arm and had traveled several thousand feet to hit the wall. The wall is frozen, Zen exclaimed, his eyes flashing. Zen had no idea how things worked on the other shore, but in reality, anything that was frozen would become crisp. Now Zen was in a desperate situation, and as the idea crossed his mind, he rushed along the smoke wall and headed towards the sword mark on the wall. Whoosh, whoosh, whoosh. Thousands of champion fish were still chasing Zen, leaving hardly any space for Zen to move. Crack, a champion fish caught up with him and bit him on the shoulder. Zen's soul force burst out at the immense pain. Mind sword. In a flash of white, 3 mind swords shot out simultaneously and circled around Zen, killing a lot of champion fish and clearing some space for him. He continued along the space and finally closed in on the sword mark. His body ached from all the wounds that the champion fish had inflicted on him. Break. Zen was finally relieved. Uncaring about everything else, he activated his mind sword to hit the wall. Crack, 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 the wall that had been tough before became so crisp that it cracked under Zen's blow. A large round hole appeared on the wall. Chapter 2825, Leaving the Other Shore. For a moment, Zen stared at the enormous, gaping hole in the wall in surprise. The impact of Milo's sword strike was stronger than he thought. Quickly, he moved forward and passed through the hole in the wall. Once he got outside, Zen paused, observing the scene around him. A lot of disciples from the Bearing race and the Divine Farmer race were clustered around the hole on the outer side of the wall, goggling at him. When the wall had first appeared, trapping the disciples of the Oneness Sky Palace inside, they hadn't been able to do anything. They could only wait anxiously outside. So it came as a shock to everyone when a hole was suddenly blown in the wall, and a man emerged, seemingly unscathed. Didn't they say that the wall was impenetrable? How could someone manage to break through the wall and escape? Dang it, stop him, shouted Seamus. His goal was to take down all the elites of the Oneness Sky Palace, and he was determined not to allow anyone to escape from inside the wall. You want to stop me? You are courting death, Zen said coldly, glaring at Seamus. The cultivation base of those guarding the outside of the wall was much, much weaker than Zen's. Zen had the ability to kill indigo souls. There was no doubt that he would find it easy to defeat these souls of light who had not yet become indigo souls. Within the wall, Zen and the other disciples of the Oneness Sky Palace had suffered from the torment of the champion fish. This cruelty had roused his anger. Now, when he saw several souls of light moving to obey Seamus' command and attack him, Zen struck back without mercy. A white cyclone appeared on the surface of his soul. Mind Sword. The sharp Mind Sword formed between Zen's eyebrows and shot forward. The invisible sword radiance slashed through the air and instantly killed the 6 people in front of Zen. 3 of the dead had been close to becoming indigo souls. The disciples of the Bearing race looked at the bodies of the dead with wide eyes, struck with terror. Who was the young man who had emerged from the hole in the wall? He had just killed 6 powerful people in a single blow. They instantly realized that even if they attacked him together, they would probably be no match for him. Back off. Get out of the other shore. Don't fight this guy head on. These disciples called out frantic instructions to each other as they retreated. Some left the other shore. Zen let them go. He had no way of trapping them, so if they left the other shore, there was nothing he could do. More importantly, Dorothy and the other disciples were still trapped within the wall. The huge champion fish summoned by Seamus were very difficult to defeat, so Zen needed to return immediately to help his companions. If he did not rescue them soon, they might get killed by the champion fish. He looked down at his feet. Blue light still shone brightly beneath his feet. The soul-binding threads had not disappeared when he passed through the hole in the wall. To test the soul-binding threads, Zen tried to leave the other shore. It didn't work. I must go to the temple and find a way to remove these threads, Zen thought to himself. His eyes gleamed. His body was in stage 4 of the other shore. When his soul of light left the other shore and his body entered it, he would confront the Bearing race and the Divine Farmer race once more. Then they would understand the meaning of real fear. With a soft whooshing sound, Zen's soul of light turned into a sharp arrow. He headed straight to the Oneness Sky Palace's temple. Some distance away, huddled where they had retreated, the disciples of the Bearing race and the Divine Farmer race saw Zen leave. But they made no move to stop him. They thought they wouldn't be able to stop him even if they tried. The disciples of the Oneness Sky Palace were on high alert, standing at the entrance of the temple with tense, nervous expressions. None of them dared to take a single step out of the temple. Who are you? Show me your soul mark. Someone shouted at Zen as he approached the temple. On the other shore, they could not see each other's face clearly. They were afraid that the incoming figure was a spy sent by the Bearing race. Zen raised his hand and displayed the lines on his palm. As soon as his identity had been verified, the people of the Oneness Sky Temple let Zen inside. Several people immediately formed a circle around him to ask what was going on. What happened? Why have you returned alone? Where is Ephraim? He hasn't come back yet. He seems to be trapped inside the wall. Seamus had enacted his bold plan so suddenly and unexpectedly that no one had gotten the chance to escape from the wall. The disciples in the temple realized that something terrible must be happening inside the wall, but they had no way of finding out what exactly was going on. There's no time to explain now, Zen said impatiently. Quick, help me get rid of these soul-binding threads. Some of the nearby disciples misunderstood Zen's words. They thought he was scared of what had happened and wanted to escape to the source world. Angrily, someone said, "Tell us what's going on before you flee. We should find a way to save the others. We are absolutely safe here in the temple. They don't dare to enter." Don't be so timid. The disciples were making a great mistake in jeering at Zen for his supposed cowardice when he was already so angry. Zen's face darkened and he turned sharply towards the one who had called him timid. Timid, he sneered, grabbing the disciple. The man that Zen had grabbed unceremoniously was also an indigo soul. However, under the pressure of Zen's intimidating aura, he was unable to offer up any kind of resistance. I escaped the wall to find a way to rescue the others. I need to go back as soon as possible, and yet idiots like you are slowing me down with your ignorant comments. Do you actually think any of you could save them if you tried? Zen shouted, losing his temper. Tell me the way to remove these soul-binding threads. Now. The disciple in Zen's grip looked thoroughly daunted. Go to the soul-purifying room. You can remove those soul-binding threads in there. Take me there, Zen ordered, throwing him onto the floor. The man hastily got to his feet and led Zen away. The moment the two men disappeared, all the remaining disciples began talking at once. While they had been somewhat unsettled by Zen's flash of temper, they were still convinced he was trying to leave the other shore. That guy must be really scared. From the way he looked, I'm afraid he won't dare to return to the other shore anymore. It's very selfish of him to only care about himself. There are so many Oneness Sky Palace elite disciples inside the wall. If we lose them all, it will be an enormous loss for us. Everyone nodded and sighed. They wondered what they could do to help, but they couldn't think of anything. Meanwhile, Zen soon found himself at the door of the soul-purifying room. As he stepped inside, the patterns on the wall began to glow. Zen stood in the center of the room, and the complex lights flickered and shimmered around him. He glanced down at his feet and saw the soul-binding threads dimming and then disappearing altogether. As soon as the threads were gone, Zen didn't waste any more time. He used the illusion-breaking rune to get out of the other shore and return to his own room. The moment he opened his eyes, a flame spread out from his body, completely covering him from head to toe. Then his body returned to the other shore. As soon as he entered the other shore, he flew without hesitation towards the three temples. On the way, he saw a tall statue standing at the entrance of the Bearing Race's temple. He flew headlong towards the statue. There was a loud crash as he collided with the statue. It was completely destroyed, crumbling to the ground in shards. The statue had been a valuable one. It had stood proudly in its place of honor for countless years. Shouts sounded from inside the temple when they saw the destruction. Hey, who are you? How dare you destroy the statue of our race? You are dead. Several souls of light rushed out of the temple to confront the man who had demolished their treasure. Zen ignored them. As he moved past the remnants of the statue, he kicked at the rubble, sending several stones flying like arrows towards the gate of the temple. His body strength far exceeded his soul strength. A casual kick from his body was far greater than the power of his indigo soul. He knew that the stones he had kicked would turn pillars into dust and instantly eliminate any souls of light they hit. Zen wasn't normally so bloodthirsty, but these were unusual circumstances. It had been treacherous for the disciples of the Bearing Race to lure the Oneness Sky Palace disciples into their trap to kill them all. Had it not been for Milo's astonishing sword attack that hit the wall, Zen himself would also be dead, eaten by the champion fish. To be kind to his enemy was to be cruel to himself and his companions. Right now, he had no time for lengthy combat. He needed to dispense with any distractions quickly and with finality so that he could hurry back to the wall and save the other Oneness Sky Palace disciples. Otherwise, he would directly tear down the temple of the Bearing Race. Chapter 2826, The Real Strength. Seamus scratched his chin in surprise. He didn't expect anyone would be able to escape. Then again, he didn't expect that Milo's sword strike would freeze the wall and Zen would create a hole big enough for himself to get through. With a shrug, Seamus waved the thought away. He didn't care about Zen's escape. After all, he was just one out of the many disciples gathered here. Right after his escape, disciples of the Divine Farmer race blocked the hole. What truly bothered Seamus was that the disciples of the Oneness Sky Palace still fought fiercely despite being overpowered by the champion fish. When Zen was trapped by the champion fish, Ephraim carried the severely injured Milo on his back. As Zen took care of majority of the champion fish, Ephraim and the others grabbed the opportunity to escape. However, as they were rushing out, they saw Zen cornered by a group of massive champion fish. They felt their hearts sink, knowing they failed to turn the tables and even lost Zen. Once Ephraim and Milo were safely on the other side, the other disciples pressed their backs against the wall, fighting tooth and nail to defend themselves. Did Zen really get swallowed by the champion fish? Unable to believe the news, Connor grabbed Ephraim by the arm, gripping him tightly. The other elite disciples exchanged uneasy glances. He was too impulsive. Alas, I don't think we'll be able to escape either. He isn't the only fallen disciple. Low morale permeated the atmosphere, as the disciples mourned the loss of their companions. Look, someone suddenly cried out, the champion fish are coming. Out of the 5 who had broken out of the encirclement and tried to kill Seamus, 1 had lost his life. However, they had managed to almost kill Seamus. While this lifted their spirits momentarily, they had been unable to turn the tables in their favor, dampening their spirits just as quickly. The disciples banded together, ready to fight for their lives with everything they got. However, upon a closer look, these champion fish looked different. They were bigger in size, on a higher defense level. It was extremely difficult to kill them off with only soul strength. As swarms of champion fish surged forward to close in on their prey, the Oneness Sky Palace disciples gritted their teeth. Soon, the disciples dwindled in numbers as one by one, the champion fish killed or injured them. With every lost disciple, their morale sank lower and lower. We are done for. I never expected I'd die like this. I'm not giving up, Dorothy declared as her eyes gleamed with hope. Among these disciples, only she knew that Zen was not dead. Not only was he still alive, but he had also rushed out of the wall. Because she had left a mark in Zen's soul before, she even knew where his soul was. She didn't know which stage of the other shore Zen's body was in. If he could come back here in his physical body, the crisis the Oneness Sky Palace was facing might be overcome. As those around her were about to give up, she felt helpless. Because only a small number of people knew that Zen was capable of entering the other shore in his body, she hesitated to tell the other disciples about this. Eyes darting back and forth amidst the madness, Dorothy racked her brains trying to figure out how to boost the morale of her fellow disciples. Guys, quit being too pessimistic. We have strong reinforcements on their way. Strong reinforcements? How is that possible? We won't be saved unless the elders of our Oneness Sky Palace force the Bearing Race to stop. But it seems the Bearing Race has been plotting this for a while now. Majority of the elite disciples from the Oneness Sky Palace were already here, fighting for their lives. Meanwhile, the masters in the Desire World were unable to return to the Lust World, and wouldn't be able to come to their rescue. They were doomed. There must be, Dorothy said with certainty. I promise. She could sense Zen's soul of light had already retreated from the other shore. At this rate, he should have been able to return to the other shore in his physical body by now. Looking around her, she noticed that, while her feeble attempt to cheer up the disciples was childish, they seemed to fight more fiercely now. Even though everyone had a strong desire to survive, it was still difficult for them to fight off these champion fish. The number of champion fish was doubled, and these champion fish came to the disciples to launch attacks. Ephraim and the other Oneness Sky Palace disciples managed to kill off a group of champion fish, and they cheered victoriously. However, seemingly endless hordes of champion fish still swarmed towards them. Ah, my arm! Someone screamed hysterically. When Dorothy turned to look, the champion fish had already chomped off the disciple's arm. Help, help! But before Dorothy could even react, another disciple was dragged off by a champion fish and devoured. More and more people were killed by the champion fish non-stop. In their desperation, the disciples lost all strategy and just lashed out wherever they could, leaving their attacks uncoordinated and clumsy. The air was filled with piercing screams as champion fish continued to mercilessly devour the Oneness Sky Palace disciples. Dorothy's expression darkened. Calming her soul, she reached out and clasped the necklace of mystic soul that hung from her neck. Buzz! Suddenly, a bright blue light emanated from the necklace of mystic soul. A powerful aura shot out, causing the champion fish to whirl confusedly, retreating chaotically. Somehow sensing the strange aura, Seamus smiled delightedly. That necklace is wonderful, I absolutely must get my hands on it. The champion fish still swam about in complete chaos, temporarily out of control due to their fear. But Dorothy couldn't hold out forever. The power of the necklace of mystic soul only lasted half a minute before the aura began to fade. What was worse, she could not summon the sword now. When the champion fish sensed the aura growing weaker, they surged forward once again. At this point, most of the disciples had accepted defeat, resigning themselves to their gruesome fate. We're all going to die. There's no use trying to resist, said a lonesome voice. Dorothy sat on the steps of an altar, gritting her teeth. Her mind was filled with doubt. Could she be wrong about Zen? Did he run away and refuse to come back? Or did he not make it because his body hadn't reached stage 4 of the other shore? Dorothy sighed. Disciples all around her fell prey to the champion fish. Unable to watch this gruesome scene anymore, she closed her eyes. Just as she was about to completely give in to her despair, she suddenly heard the sound of cloth being ripped violently. Opening her eyes, she turned towards the direction of the sound. Much to her surprise, a large crack appeared on the wall not too far from her. A pair of hands reached in from the other side of the wall, ripping open the crack. From the hole in the wall, a person stepped inside. The disciples whipped their heads around to face the new presence. They could sense this person was not a soul of light, but a physical body. Who was he? How did a physical body get here? Haven't there been rumors about him? Someone has entered the sea of truth with his body. Is he the one? Although everyone was confused, they still had their guard up. After all, they didn't know if he was friend or foe. The Oneness Sky Palace disciples had lost the will to fight, and froze in place, unsure of what to do. Even Seamus hesitated, unsure as to how to deal with this newcomer. But before he found the words to say, the figure stepped onto an altar. Bang! With just a stomp, the champion fish altar was smashed into thousands of pieces. All the champion fish that were born from that altar suddenly exploded into thin air. What are you doing? Stop! Seamus shouted at the figure in shocked anger. The Bering race had paid a price to get these altars that could produce champion fish. Each of the altars was extremely precious. Seamus didn't expect that someone could destroy the altars. Zen ignored Seamus and proceeded to jump onto another altar, crushing it beneath his feet. Bang! The second altar was smashed to pieces, and again, many champion fish vanished. With every step he took, Zen trampled a champion fish altar. Before Seamus even had the time to react, more than 10 altars were destroyed, with nothing left but shards. Chapter 2827, Pulverize. Seamus stared at the broken altars. He clenched his fist as he felt his heart slowly breaking into pieces. He had gone to such great lengths to take the altars here in advance. They weren't souls of light that could be withdrawn from the other shore instantly. If he wanted to move them back, it wouldn't be easy work. The Bering race did so much to acquire the altars. They were like treasures to them that would help them suppress other super forces in the lust world of the other shore. Stop him! Shouted Seamus. The warriors of the divine farmer race started to make their moves. From the ground, seeds suddenly sprouted with vines that rapidly moved towards Zen. The power of the vines was not weak. As soon as the souls of light were restrained by the vines, it would be difficult for them to break free. Swoosh, swoosh, swoosh. Soon enough, Zen was also tightly wrapped by green vines. Moments ago, when the disciples from the Oneness Sky Palace saw how the man displayed his mighty strength, they had their hopes pinned on him. Now they started to feel worry when they saw that the man was entangled. Crack! Within 3 seconds, Zen was able to break free from the vines. He jumped up and trampled on another altar. Bang! Bang! Boom! Zen trampled on each altar and broke them one by one. He walked half-circle along the wall and broke each champion fish altar he walked past. He must have broken more than 50. No longer attempting to focus on killing the elite disciples from the Oneness Sky Palace, Seamus simply ordered the remaining champion fish to attack Zen all at once. Tear him up! Seamus was seething with anger. Everything was going according to plan until the physical body's sudden appearance. He had no idea how this had happened. Those champion fish indeed posed a great threat to souls of light. Even Zen's soul of light was unable to withstand the biting of the champion fish, but it was a different case when his physical body was involved. He was unthreatened by the champion fish as his body remained unfazed. He saw them to be low-level beasts. Zen screamed so hard that his body trembled slightly. As his body vibrated, anything that came in contact with him shattered into pieces. It didn't take him a lot of effort. It was a low-level skill of the might godly way that had no use to deal with warriors at the other shore realm in the source world. However, it was easy enough for it to work to deal with these champion fish. Zen hurled himself towards the torrent of the champion fish. Any champion fish that touched his body erupted into a cloud of blood. What trick is that? It's so terrifying. This man must be invincible on the other shore. The disciples from the Oneness Sky Palace murmured and whispered among themselves. They could not comprehend Zen's powers. That's not a unique skill. He's just vibrating his physical body. What's strange is that he used his body to enter the other shore, one of the disciples from the Oneness Sky Palace said. He had seen through Zen's little trick. Crack, 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 champion fish turned into blood wherever he went. Within 30 seconds, all of the huge champion fish inside the wall were dead. Huge champion fish still came out of the mirrors on the remaining altars, but they did not replenish fast enough. Zen was still able to kill all of them before they became too many. Dorothy, seated on the steps of an altar, was finally breathing easy. Zen's physical body had a lot of potential uses on the other shore. But after he entered the Oneness Sky Palace, he was focused on his cultivation. Today, he finally found a chance to display his physical power. Zen continued to pulverize the remaining champion fish and destroy the altars. Boom, boom, boom. As soon as the last altar was crushed, all the champion fish disappeared. Seamus stomped his way towards Zen. "You, who on earth are you?" Seamus asked feebly. Zen gazed at him coldly, looked him in the eye, and said, "You are not qualified to know." He found no reason to expose his identity. However, he knew that he might have shown too much of his skills. Just the fact that he was able to go through the wall and returned in his physical form could easily connect him with his true identity. However, even if some of them had speculations, they had no evidence. "I don't care who you are. Everyone who has offended our race will die," Seamus retorted with a chuckle. It was truly inconceivable that a corporeal body entered the other shore. But there was only one such person here and Seamus assumed that he posed no threat. Seamus perked up and made sure he looked unfazed. "If you join our bearing race, we can assure you great success," he said proudly. "What do you think? Join you?" Zen snorted. "Yes, won't that be great?" Seamus held on to a sliver of hope. He wanted Zen to agree. "Not really." Zen shook his head. "What a pity," Seamus responded. "If you won't join us, then get ready to be our enemy. I'll always remember what you did today. The world is big, but the other shore is small. We'll meet again." Seamus turned to leave. Despite what happened, he remained bloated with arrogance. He was able to enter and exit the other shore freely, so leaving here would be easy. Soon, he would be back in the source world. Seamus's soul of light began to blur. Suddenly, Zen's chuckles echoed in the air. "I don't think we'll ever meet again," he said. "What?" Seamus was shocked. Behind him, a soul of light quietly approached him. It was Ephraim. Souls of light relied on spiritual sense to perceive everything on the other shore. Fortunately, Ephraim had the special ability to hide his aura. His soul flame glowed with a sinister green light that emitted no heat. It protected him and allowed him to sneak up on Seamus. Splash! Ephraim threw a handful of blue sand. Soul-restraining sand. Like the soul-binding thread, the soul-restraining sand could prevent souls of light from leaving the other shore. It was what the Oneness Sky Palace used to trap people, while the soul-binding thread was more favored by the bearing race. They both had their own advantages. The surface of Seamus's soul was tainted with the soul-restraining sand. He emitted a faint blue glow. Suddenly, his soul of light became visible again. He shivered in fear. Under his breath, he was chanting the illusion-breaking rune in an attempt to break through the illusory other shore. However, the grains of the soul-restraining sand firmly nailed him to the other shore. Every time he recited the illusion-breaking rune, the light emitted from the soul-restraining sand intensified. "Chant all you want. You're stuck here." Ephraim had a sinister smile on his face when he walked over. Realizing that he couldn't leave the other shore, Seamus turned around and, with full speed, rushed towards the temple of the bearing race. But of course, Zen was not going to let him go. He caught up with Seamus and gently lifted him up. Seamus tried to counterattack. His soul force burst forth all of a sudden, forming two gray crescent-shaped energy waves that came at Zen like scissors. Still, with Zen's physical body, it was impossible that an indigo soul could hurt him. Crack, crack. Suddenly, there were two crisp sounds, but Seamus's attack failed to even leave a mark on Zen's neck. Chapter 2828, Begging for Pardon. A look of despair appeared on Seamus' face when he saw that Zen was unharmed. Seamus couldn't believe that after he had unleashed an all-out strike, he didn't cause even a little damage to Zen. Zen released a small portion of his strength, staring coldly at Seamus as he prepared to crush his soul. But Ephraim suddenly shouted, "Don't kill him." Seamus had started this entire incident because he wanted to get revenge on Milo, who injured his younger brother. However, it was obvious the people of the bearing race had used that as an excuse to attack and kill as many Oneness Sky Palace disciples as they could. This event would leave a lasting impact. It would cause a dispute between the Oneness Sky Palace and the bearing race that would linger for a long time. But Ephraim realized that as long as Seamus was alive, they could use him to gather evidence against the bearing race. At Ephraim's words, Zen paused, halting his attack. To Zen's astonishment, at the precise moment that he stopped his strike, Seamus' soul of light began twisting and contorting. Seamus let out a series of strange, piteous screams. There was an awful ripping sound. Seamus, soul of light, was torn into pieces in front of Zen. Zen was dumbfounded. "I didn't kill him." Ephraim frowned. "He was killed. Someone else killed him." As they entered the other shore with their souls of light, their bodies still remained somewhere in the source world. Ephraim was suggesting that someone near Seamus' body in the source world had been responsible for his death. The failure of their trick had brought many members of the Bering race back to the source world. Now that Seamus was unable to go back, there must be something wrong with him. Some powerful warriors could know from the souls of their juniors what happened in the other shore. When some masters of the Bering race found that Seamus had been captured, they killed him immediately. Dang it, swore Zen, gritting his teeth. Wait, why does your voice sound familiar? Ephraim asked, glancing at Zen in confusion. Except for Dorothy, the others didn't know Zen's real identity. He had consciously lowered his voice so they wouldn't recognize him. But in the heat of the moment, Zen had forgotten to alter his voice, so he caught Ephraim's attention. Fortunately, Ephraim was not expecting Zen to be here. Zen cleared his throat and lowered his voice again, ignoring Ephraim's question. I just didn't expect the Bering race to be so decisive. Cupping his hands toward Zen, Ephraim said, I agree, and thank you very much for your help, sir. May I know your name? Zen grinned. Just call me Thad. Zen's family name, Luo, was rare in the Oneness Sky Palace. So he decided to use only Thad as his name. Ephraim nodded, repeating the name silently to himself. He would keep that in mind when they left the other shore. More disciples of the Oneness Sky Palace swarmed around Zen, peppering him with questions. Standing in the crowd, Sophia looked at Zen. She had suspected him to be Zen before. Now she was certain, yet she could see that Zen didn't intend to reveal his identity, so neither would she. She would not expose him against his will, especially after he had just saved everyone's lives. All right, let's go back to the temple first, Zen said, fending off the questions everyone was asking him. Many disciples had been killed. Some were injured, their souls damaged by the champion fish. Milo was also still in a coma. They had no time to waste. The group gathered everyone who had sustained injuries and headed back to the temple. Dorothy stayed where she was. As soon as everyone was gone, she went to Zen. So now what? What are we going to do next? Zen gazed coldly at the temple of the Bering race. His eyes narrowed, and he sneered, next, I want to tear down this temple. Tear down their temple? Dorothy raised her eyebrows. It sounded like a crazy plan. Follow me, Zen said as he walked towards the temple. Even before this latest incident, Zen had wanted to demolish the temple of the Bering race. At that time, however, there was peace between the Oneness Sky Palace and the Bering race, so he didn't take any action. Now that they were in the middle of a full-blown conflict, he had no qualms about finally destroying their temple. All right, Dorothy sighed. Although Dorothy was a bit concerned, she didn't hesitate. If Zen was determined, then she would support him fully. During what had happened on the other shore, the Oneness Sky Palace in the Source World was alert as well. So many elites of the Oneness Sky Palace were in a precarious situation as they were trapped. Their deaths would be a huge loss to the Oneness Sky Palace. Moreover, many of them were mountains, direct descendants. Even when this incident had just happened, some disciples in the temple quickly returned to the Source World and reported it to the elders of their mountains. Masters of the 7 mountains gathered together to discuss how to deal with the situation. Athamar showed up to join in the meeting. At first, the masters considered the possibility that the Bering race intended to declare a war. But that didn't seem to fit. A true, all-out war among the superpowers would be devastating for all involved. And if the Bering race and the Divine Farmer race had wanted to do the most damage, it would have been better for them to attack the Oneness Sky Palace with all their powers instead of provoking a small-scale war on the other shore. It didn't make sense, as this kind of action would only alert the powerful leaders of the Oneness Sky Palace and put them on guard. As more and more news came from Stage 4 of the other shore, the masters of the 7 mountains soon grasped that the people of the Bering race were killing the disciples of the Oneness Sky Palace, using revenge on Milo as an excuse. As the Bering race grew more and more powerful, they knew that the Oneness Sky Palace would hesitate before going to war against them. Now they had managed to eliminate a number of elites from the Oneness Sky Palace with a convenient excuse. Blaming their actions on Milo allowed them to evade responsibility for what they had just done. After all, they could claim that it was Milo who had started the conflict, and they were just trying to avenge one of their own. Indeed, it didn't even matter whether or why Milo had injured Seamus' brother. The only thing that mattered was that getting revenge on Milo was a story plausible enough that the Oneness Sky Palace couldn't refute. Over the span of several hours, the masters of the 7 mountains had tried to contact the Bering race through various channels, but the news that had been sent back was discouraging. Some who replied were evasive and dishonest. Some outright ignored them. There were even a few who accused the masters of allowing their disciple to hurt the people of the bearing race. All this filled the masters of the 7 mountains with righteous indignation. Some of the masters, including Yasemin, were furious enough to suggest directly confronting the bearing race. Yasemin was indignant because her beloved granddaughter was involved in the conflict. They were discussing countermeasures when a new report arrived. Report: according to the message from disciples in the temple, most of the elite disciples of our palace have managed to get to safety. This news was quite welcome. The masters were initially surprised, then their shock gave way to joy. The information they had previously collected had seemed to suggest that their elites probably wouldn't be able to survive. The risk of this terrible outcome had prompted them to beg for a pardon for their elites from the bearing race. It seems that the bearing race has given in. Good news. We must verify that they are truly safe as soon as possible. As they celebrated, another news arrived. This time, the report came from the bearing race. Report: message from the bearing race. What is it? Asked the head of the Golden Mountain quickly. Tell us the news. The man reporting the news replied, they beg us to pardon them. They want us to stop tearing down their temple. The mountain heads and the warriors who were present looked at each other in confusion, unsure as to what this was about. Who was destroying the temple of the bearing race? Chapter 2829, Destruction. Even the person who had brought them the message looked puzzled, unable to decipher the meaning of the message. Destroying the temple? Were they serious? It was widely known that it wasn't easy to build a temple at the other shore. It was as difficult as destroying one. He couldn't believe that someone belonging to the Oneness Sky Palace had really been able to destroy the temple of the bearing race. The heads of the mountains and many other masters of the Oneness Sky Palace present were just as bewildered as he was. They couldn't understand the rapid change in the attitude of the bearing race as a whole. And what did they mean by begging them for pardon? Who brought the message to you? Athamar asked. The fire emissary of the bearing race, the person replied. The 5 element emissaries were the 5 famous warriors of the bearing race who shared a high status in the great race. What does he mean? Is he serious? Is someone really tearing down their temple? That's something I'd like to know too. There are many restrictions imposed on the temples. They can't be destroyed by ordinary people. The heads of the various mountains erupted into discussion, each one of them secretly happy about the development. This was because the bearing race had earlier attempted to kill the elite disciples of the Oneness Sky Palace. Now that they were getting their retribution, it was a huge relief to the people of the Oneness Sky Palace. Athamar thought for a moment before turning to the messenger and saying, "This is our response to the bearing race. We don't know who is tearing down their temple. We will conduct our own investigation before we give them another reply." "Yes, Master," the messenger said, bowing with respect. He then turned around and quickly exited the meeting hall. After Seamus's failure, the remainder of the bearing race and the divine farmer race had either left the other shore or retreated to their temples. They still thought their temples were safe places where they could hide in peace. It was not easy to take down a temple. After the 9 Li race had been defeated by the bearing race in the war back then, they had escaped and gone into hiding. Only a small number of them had stayed on to guard their temple. Even so, the bearing race and the divine farmer race had continued to attack their temple for a long time before finally taking it down. And now, the bearing race was full of powerful warriors. Once other races began to attack their temple, a large number of their own people would come there for aid. The number of restrictions on their temple meant that nobody could easily invade it. Just like the disciples of the Oneness Sky Palace, many members of the bearing race also stood in front of the gates of their temple and watched on in curiosity. How did Seamus fail? Didn't he say his plan was faultless? Who knows what happened inside the smoke wall? It seems that someone tore the wall with bare hands. How can there be such a powerful warrior in the Lust world? I don't believe it. While the members of the bearing race watched and whispered among themselves, Zen and Dorothy made their way over to them. Dorothy was on full alert, walking at a much slower pace than Zen. Nobody would dare provoke him, especially since he had appeared here with his physical body. But Dorothy might face dangers since she was only an indigo soul. She was ready to leave the other shore at a moment's notice if any unfavorable situation were to arise. Someone is coming at us. That guy in the front. He's not a soul. What's wrong with him? Many members of the bearing race still didn't know what was going on. But as they watched Zen walking aggressively towards them, many of them left the other shore for safety. Some of them hid deep within their temple, while a few remained at the entrance, waiting for Zen to reach them. Once Zen was close enough, they brought their hands together in respect and politely began to ask him, "Friend, what business has brought you to our But Zen didn't heed them. He walked up to the wall and kicked a temple pillar. 4 huge pillars supported the main entrance of the temple of the bearing race. Each of them was 10 feet wide and supremely strong. But Zen's kick broke half the pillar into pieces, causing rubble to fly in all directions. The members of the bearing race present there ducked, scared of Zen's sudden violence. Bang! Zen landed a kick on the next pillar, destroying it by sending a crack through the middle. What are you doing? Don't you know that our race is the most? A member of the bearing race came forward bravely, his voice trembling with fear. But Zen couldn't be bothered with him. He merely turned around and kicked the 3rd pillar. Zen had every reason to kill these crooked people in revenge, given the things that the bearing race had done to the disciples of the Oneness Sky Palace. But he held himself back. The 4 pillars of the temple broke apart under Zen's violent kicks, causing the top of the temple to collapse with crashing groans and thuds. The members of the bearing race left the other shore for fear of being buried under the rubble of their temple. Zen rushed inside the temple after tearing down the entrance. But since he wasn't a member of the bearing race, the moment he stepped inside, the restrictions imposed on the temple were immediately triggered by the invasion. Just a few feet from Zen, a dozen tiles on the ground suddenly flipped over, beams of white light shooting out of the devices hidden beneath them. The soul-purifying light. Most temples were equipped with such devices. Even an indigo soul would be eliminated without a trace on being hit by the soul-purifying light. Such was the terrible cost of trespassing into an unfamiliar temple, which was why no one was usually willing to invade a temple. Zen's physical body, though, was not afraid of the soul-purifying light. The bright light illuminated Zen's body, but caused no damage at him. Dorothy stood outside the temple and watched. She wouldn't enter it until Zen had destroyed all the restrictions inside the temple. With several snaps, Zen moved swiftly around the temple and destroyed the devices within the tiles. All the soul-purifying light vanished into thin air. He then set his eyes on the pillars that supported the structure. Once he destroyed all of them, the entire temple would be reduced to rubble. A commotion erupted within the bearing race as Zen destroyed the temple. The 5 element emissaries were furious. Water emissary, this is all your fault. Your idea of killing the elites of the Oneness Sky Palace has brought us no benefits and is showing us this horrific day. And now they even dare destroy our temple. What a shame. Fire emissary, did the Oneness Sky Palace respond to our plea? Fire emissary folded his hands before his companions and said, I have received their reply. They have declared that they knew nothing about the temple destroyer and that they would send people to investigate this matter. Pooh, don't believe a word of it. Metal emissary sneered disdainfully before continuing, tell them that if they don't stop tearing down our temple, we'll go and invade their base. Are you serious? Fire emissary said, rolling his eyes at him. Do you think the people of the Oneness Sky Palace will believe that? The conflict at the stage 4 of the other shore was quite a common one. Even if both sides were furious at their losses, they would restrain themselves in public and only seek retribution in secrecy. If the 2 great forces were to start a full-scale war, the whole world would be thrown into a state of chaos. Invading the Oneness Sky Palace would just be a joke. But what should we do now? Water emissary asked anxiously. The temple at stage 4 was the first station for their warriors on the other shore. Even if they reached stage 13, they usually needed to return to the temple for one reason or the other. It would be a great loss to the bearing race if their temple was completely destroyed. More importantly, there was a considerable amount of soul crystal stored in the temple. The soul crystal was left behind for the descendants of the race. But once their temple was destroyed, this important resource would fall into enemy hands. Chapter 2830, Make a Concession. While the 5 element emissaries from bearing race remained anxious, Zen had already entered the central hall of the temple through the entrance. On one side of the central hall, there was a wall on which a big bear statue was engraved as decoration. The carvings and delicate details on the statue were exquisitely sophisticated. After Zen looked around in all directions, he approached the wall and placed his hand on it. He had intended to destroy it to have a look at what was on the other side. Just as he began to break it down, a man showed up behind him and shouted, "You cannot destroy that wall." The man that suddenly appeared was an indigo soul. Zen immediately concluded him to be a member of the bearing race. "You think you can stop me?" Zen turned his face towards him and sneered meaningfully. "Yes, I do." After saying this, the man abruptly made a move and pounced on Zen. Immediately, Zen spurned this mere indigo soul and disposed of him like a bothersome gnat. As Zen waved his hand, the man was effortlessly thrown back for a few feet before he crashed into a wall. He went easy on him this time. If he had added more strength in his blow, the man's soul of light would have been shattered. With no more hindrances in his way, Zen approached the wall a second time. Wasting no time, he pressed hard on the wall with his right hand and applied a little pressure. Now then, let's see what we could find. Crack. Not long after, the wall couldn't bear any more pressure, and it collapsed inwards. He watched intently as the wall cracked up and revealed hidden compartments within it. These secret compartments were in 13 rows. And in each of them, there lay a piece of other shore token. Among the many other shore tokens that now lay bare to him, 3 distinct ones in the 13th row caught his attention. A golden sculpture carved in the shape of a bull, a rhombus-shaped green gem, and a pair of curved feet of a monster. He ran his eyes across them as if to scan these tokens and counted them in his heart. There were more than 100 other shore tokens in total from stage 1 to stage 13 of the other shore. You can't touch those other shore tokens. They belong to our bearing race. 2 more people appeared on the scene and shouted while pointing at the other shore tokens. Similar to the Oneness Sky Palace, the bearing race also collected various other shore tokens and kept them inside the wall for the members of their own race to use. However, they had never imagined someone like Zen would infiltrate their temple and attempt to steal them before they moved them away. Not anymore, they belong to me now, Zen chuckled in amusement, staring at their frustrated faces. These other shore tokens must hold a lot of value in the market. Zen might not need them for himself, but he could sell them for something else. However, he did not have a Sumeru space of his own, as he was now in the form of his physical body. Collecting these other shore tokens and storing them would be a problem. Zen had called Dorothy to aid him in his invasion for this reason. The 2 men felt anxiety growing inside them as Zen remained firm to his cause. It was apparent the most they could do was attack him without caring about what would happen to them. Suddenly, they rushed towards him to try and take him down. Zen was starting to get a little impatient. These guys would prove to be a nuisance if they weren't dealt with once and for all. Puff, puff. This time, Zen exerted a little more force than before and threw them heavy punches. Although they were not dead, their souls of light had taken massive irreversible damage. In the darkness inside the temple, the many members of the bearing race stood watching the scene helplessly. They hung their heads loosely from their necks in defeat. They could guess Zen's ultimate reason for coming here was to avenge the attack on the Oneness Sky Palace. But they had never expected him to be so ruthless. If only they hadn't done what they had to the Oneness Sky Palace, they wouldn't have to swallow the bitter pill they received at present. For the sake of her safety, Zen hadn't called Dorothy in. After dealing with the members of the bearing race, Zen proceeded to penetrate the wall with his 2 hands. Soon, the immense wall was lifted off the ground whole before Zen carried it onto his shoulders and walked out of the temple casually. That guy, shoot, he can enter the other shore with his physical body. We can't compare to his strength. He's too terrifying, we can't compete with him. Noticing Dorothy from afar, Zen walked up to her smiling ear to ear with the wall still on his shoulders. Before he set it down, he glanced at her and said, "Put these away for me." Dorothy smiled tenderly, her soul of light fluttered around the wall. With quick hands, she conjured up a blue square on her slender fingers. Soon after, those other shore tokens were all sucked into the square. Wow, quite a find if I do say so myself. Dorothy let out a scream in excitement. Zen chuckled at her reaction and shook his head. This is nothing, I will have a bigger surprise for you, just wait and see. Just then, a man rushed over in their direction, almost out of breath. Wait, slow down. Zen paused to glance at him and asked, why? What's wrong? The man got closer to Zen's ear and whispered in a low voice, Master Athamar has requested you to stop destroying the temple of the bearing race. Zen sighed at his request and frowned to himself. He had already torn down almost half of the temple, and he did not plan on stopping there. But now, Athamar had asked him to halt his attacks. It was probably because the bearing race had asked the Oneness Sky Palace to do so, or maybe they had come to a compromise between both parties. Fine, I'll stop, Zen said with an exasperated sigh as he raised his hands in defeat. The messenger was a little shocked at Zen agreeing with Athamar's wishes so quickly. He never expected Zen would listen without much persuasion. In the eyes of the disciples of the Oneness Sky Palace, such a man who could enter the other shore with his physical body could not be easily controlled. He never expected Zen to be so obedient. What relationship does Master Athamar share with this guy? But, I will take what I deserve, Zen said as the corners of his mouth turned into a mischievous smile. The over 100 other shore tokens he just gathered had no value in Zen's eyes. Instead, he would give them away without hesitation in exchange for soul pills and soul crystal in the future. Immediately, his mind began to wonder if the temple of the bearing race had a large amount of soul crystal, just like the other shore tokens. He could stop destroying the temple as ordered, but he would take what he came to get. It seemed the indigo soul was not the destination of the soul. Later, he would definitely need more soul crystal as he would surpass the lust world to enter the desire world. Meanwhile, in the great hall of the Oneness Sky Palace in the Source World, a disciple sat upright in the center, while the masters waited for him to wake up and bring the news of Zen's response. I doubt that guy would listen to Athamar. Now that his physical body has entered the other shore, he must be unstoppable. Alas, I hope he can show some mercy. I didn't expect the bearing race would make such a huge concession. Several masters hung their heads with a hint of worry on their faces. Just then, another news came from the bearing race, offering a compromise. They had proposed to order the Sun Crow race to withdraw from the Mountain Viewing Province. The dispute between the Sun Crow race and the Oneness Sky Palace in the Mountain Viewing Province had lasted for many years. It was always a headache to the Oneness Sky Palace. Back then, when the Sun Crow race had a conflict with the humans of the Oneness Sky Palace, the bearing race played a huge part in adding fuel to the fire. If they could end their war with the Sun Crow race by stopping Zen from destroying the temple, it could be beneficial for both parties. But they didn't think that mysterious guy would obey Athamar's instructions. Among all the masters present, only Athamar, Madame Yasamine, Winchell, and Goran knew Zen was that guy. When Athamar asked someone to take a message to Zen, Yasamine glanced at him with meaningful eyes. After a while, the disciple opened his eyes and awakened. He returned the hopeful gazes of the masters and said, "That guy has agreed to not destroy their temple, but he still wants to go inside." "Why does he want to go to the temple?" The master of Ivory Mountain spoke up in curiosity. "The bearing race has accumulated countless treasures over the years. He wants to gather the things he wants from them. I really have no idea where this greedy guy came from," laughed the master of the Golden Mountain. Chapter 2831, Plunder. Zen was a lot calmer when he stepped into the temple of the bearing race again. He no longer continued to destroy the temple. He started looking around the temple. Thankfully, its structure was simple. He walked through the rest half of the temple as the warriors of the bearing race stood, watching. Their souls of light glowed a nervous sheen. Suddenly, the faces of the bearing race warriors dimmed with the sudden realization of what Zen was looking for. Two things were of great value in the temple, the other shore tokens and the soul crystal. He already took the other shore tokens, which meant he was aiming for the soul crystal. Zen took a glance at the scene before him. There were several forks ahead and each fork had warriors guarding them, but the road right in front of him had the largest number of warriors. His lips curled into a smile. The bearing race basically gave away the route leading to the soul crystal. As Zen approached, souls of light stood firmly and blocked his way. They had no intentions of making way for him. "You can't go in," said one of the warriors. "This is an important part of our temple." Zen shook his head. "Try and stop me," he dared. He had already destroyed half of the temple. The warriors here weren't in the position to reason with him. Despite this, they stood their ground. Zen stepped forward. He bumped them and caused everyone to stagger away. Some of them tried to approach Zen to grab him, but as they neared him, Zen simply flicked his wrist and threw them out. Once all of them were out of his way, he continued on his path to the depths of the temple. "Alas, this is our fault. We shouldn't have set up a trap for the disciples of the Oneness Sky Palace. We are taking the consequences of our own deeds. I haven't received my soul crystal yet. It seems that I won't have any chance to get it." The bearing race collectively sighed. A heavy air rose as depression dawned on them. It was extremely difficult for ordinary warriors to improve their souls on the other shore. The only luck they could count on was if they were able to acquire some soul crystal from the temples and wilderness. However, warriors and disciples from the super forces often had the resources to improve themselves rapidly. Zen and Dorothy were two of these warriors. They were able to have indigo souls almost effortlessly. If anyone plundered the soul crystal in the temple, then the warriors of the bearing race here would have little to no hope to further their improvement. Unfortunately, they remained inferior to Zen's powers, so they were unable to stop him. In the innermost room of the temple, a thick wall covered with small holes stood. Several warriors of the bearing race busily gathered in front of it before Zen arrived. They were ordered to use their Sumeru spaces to absorb as much soul crystal as they could. They diligently did as they were ordered. However, the design of the temple prohibited them from maximizing their collection. They were not fast enough. Although they worked non-stop, they only managed to absorb a small part of the soul crystal. "Everyone get out," Zen shouted coldly. The several warriors were horrified. They were afraid of being killed by Zen, so they immediately ran for their lives. Zen's method of taking the soul crystal was simple and crude. He pressed his hand on the wall and gently patted it. The wall burst open and revealed a huge stone covered by tiny holes, like a beehive. Each hole emitted a bright light. He simply lifted the huge stone and walked out like it was no big deal. The members of the bearing race were mortified. They were losing the little hope they had. As he walked out of the temple, Zen tossed the stone towards Dorothy. Dorothy gasped at the sight of the stone. "You have taken all the soul crystal of the bearing race." The stone was called Myriad Holes Stone. It stored the soul crystal perfectly. The bearing race sealed the stone in the thick wall when they built the temple. Some disciples of the race would also store the soul crystal they found on the other shore in it. The Oneness Sky Palace also used such stone to store their soul crystal. "Absorb the soul crystal into your Sumeru space quickly before something happens," Zen said with a soft chuckle. Dorothy nodded and put her hand on the stone. The soul crystal in the small holes gathered inside the square space in her hand. Zen stared at Dorothy's square space and thought to himself, "I should get another Sumeru space." Unlike his soul, his corporeal body couldn't hold things, so he always had to ask Dorothy to keep items for him. She would then transfer the items to his soul of light. It was very inconvenient. He wondered if the Oneness Sky Palace would be able to provide his corporeal body with a Sumeru space. As soon as all the soul crystal was kept by Dorothy, Zen tossed the stone onto a pile of ruins that used to be a part of the temple. Together, they left the place. When they arrived at the gate of the temple of the Oneness Sky Palace, Zen's body quietly retreated from the other shore. This time, he was able to get a lot of soul crystal. Though the bearing race had transferred a part of it before his arrival. What he acquired was enough for 8 warriors to achieve indigo souls. Eventually, Zen's soul of light returned to the temple of the Oneness Sky Palace. As soon as it did, he grabbed Dorothy into the secret room. Dorothy quickly transferred all the soul crystal to him. "Shouldn't we share it equally?" Zen asked. "No, I don't need it," Dorothy replied. It was Zen who obtained the soul crystal, anyway. She merely helped in safekeeping it. She didn't think she deserved any of it. Since Dorothy was so determined not to take any, Zen didn't insist. He just decided to generously share it with her in the future should she need it. Zen had been itching to go to higher stages of the other shore since he had the indigo soul. But considering what happened that day, his plan would be delayed. "I wanted to go to stage 13 with you, but it looks like I wouldn't be able to do that," Zen said. Hearing this, Dorothy blushed and giggled. "Let's go back first. I'm sure the Oneness Sky Palace and bearing race are in chaotic states now." Zen then retreated from the other shore. With the space twisting a bit, he was sitting in his room again. When he removed the enchanted barrier and opened the door, he saw 3 guests in the courtyard. Goran, Winchell, and Athamar stood in the middle of the courtyard while Trish and Carrie served them tea. It looked like they were there to visit Zen. Trish and Carrie looked worried. Letitia stood on the second floor just as worried as Trish and Carrie. They wondered what Zen had done wrong. Although she couldn't see through the real strength of these men, for some reason unknown to her, the aura the men exuded made her tremble. Letitia couldn't figure out why such figures came to visit Zen and were willing to wait quietly in the courtyard. She wanted to call Zen out, but before she could, the 3 men stopped her as if they were afraid of disturbing him. Chapter 2832, Failing to get the Sumeru space. The moment Zen pushed the door open, Letitia hurriedly told him, "Zen, these guests have already been waiting here for a long time." Zen noticed that Letitia was a little nervous, so he comforted her first. After that, he escorted her down from the second floor. "Welcome, masters." As Zen reached downstairs, he promptly bowed to the 3 people before him. Athamar asked, "Who is she?" "This is my principal wife. Tia, greet these masters," Zen responded honestly. As Zen finished his words, Letitia bowed to them then respectfully retreated to the side. The 3 of them regarded Zen with meaningful expressions. They thought back on what happened in the Vastness Mountain not long ago. They were surprised that Zen had been married. They also wondered if he already had a child and if Yasmin and Flamen knew about this. But of course, it was none of their business. They came here to discuss what happened on the other shore. To keep the absolute confidentiality of this topic, Athamar set up an invisible enchanted barrier with a wave of his hand. In this way, he could prevent Letitia, Trish, and Carrie from hearing their conversation. Letitia perfectly knew that they came here to discuss something important with Zen. Since she was not interested in intruding in their affairs, she quietly stood aside. "You were truly amazing today. You destroyed half a temple of the bearing race. You probably have lots of harvests, right?" Athamar said as he laughed, as if he actually saw Zen rob the temple. Zen cupped his hands and said, I took all their other shore tokens and soul crystal inside. I could just hand them over if the Oneness Sky Palace wouldn't be able to endure their anger. Because he destroyed the temple of the Bearing race, the Oneness Sky Palace must be under a lot of pressure. Zen didn't want to cause any more troubles for the palace. You are quite gracious, Winchell said as he looked at Zen with admiration. If it was him in this position, he probably wouldn't be willing to hand them over. Hearing this, Goran snorted. He said, for many years, the Oneness Sky Palace was bullied by the Bearing race. This time, you subdued them with your own power. What can they do to us next? You got them with your efforts so naturally, they now belong to you. But I'm worried that the Bearing race would seek revenge against the palace. Zen seemed hesitant. For the past years, people have fought repeatedly for profit in the source world, Athamar said after he took a sip of his tea. A fierce war will break out sooner or later. Even if we don't provoke them, they will probably take revenge on us when that time comes. However, they might not dare take actions now. The three masters were very open-minded about these issues. They chose their own paths and followed their own fates. It was clear to them that a mere compromise could not stop the Bearing race from fighting against the Oneness Sky Palace. In conclusion, you must hide your identity well on the other shore. Don't expose yourself to anyone, even to those who are from our palace. Goran advised. After the accident that occurred on the other shore, the Oneness Sky Palace counted the number of trapped elite disciples. With the exception of the Vastness Mountain, all of the other 6 mountains had trapped elites. These included the Oneness Mountain and the Origin Mountain. Strangely enough, disciples from the Vastness Mountain were not involved. Because of this, Goran thought that not everyone from the Oneness Sky Palace could be trusted. Zen completely understood what they meant by this. He nodded and asked, how is Milo now? It was clear to Zen that he wouldn't have been able to escape from the combined attack from the Bearing race and the Divine Farmer race by himself. Milo finally displayed an astonishing skill which allowed Zen to escape. Without his help, the elites of the Oneness Sky Palace, including himself, would have been annihilated. With a dark look on his face, Athamar responded, he hasn't regained consciousness yet. Is his soul severely injured? Zen sighed and asked. During that time, Milo was completely engulfed by the champion fish. How was he able to bear their ceaseless biting? It's not because of the soul damage, Athamar shook his head as he explained. Then, what? Zen asked with uncertainty. You must have seen the sword strike Milo made, Athamar replied. I did, Zen nodded. For Zen, Milo's final strike was absolutely incredible. It directly froze all the champion fish and even a part of the wall. Zen was thoroughly puzzled. Milo's soul of light had not yet reached the level of indigo soul. However, his strike was much stronger than those of ordinary indigo souls. He had utterly overdrawn his talent. Therefore, he was severely punished. We are trying our best to revive him, but it takes time, said Athamar. Yet, Athamar didn't mention to Zen what talent Milo had overdrawn to launch that strike. The reason why they visited Zen was to ease his worry and confirm the truth as well. The Oneness Sky Palace would never admit that it was Zen who destroyed the temple. However, the outside world still believed that Zen had a close connection with the Oneness Sky Palace. However, other forces wouldn't be able to blame the Oneness Sky Palace for whatever Zen did on the other shore. Moreover, this could also scare other super forces and warned them that whoever dared provoke Oneness Sky Palace on the other shore would bring tragedy to themselves. Over the next couple days, the Bearing race negotiated with the Oneness Sky Palace. They demanded that the man who destroyed their temple return their soul crystal and other shore tokens. The Oneness Sky Palace only admitted that they indeed stopped that man from demolishing the entire temple. However, it was beyond their ability to ask him to return the soul crystal and other shore tokens he took from the temple, for they had no idea who that man was. This kind of statement was almost hard to disprove. The Bearing race needed to swallow this bitter loss. Despite their anger, they kept their word. They asked the Sun Crow race to retreat from the Mountain Viewing province. With this, the war between the Oneness Sky Palace and the Sun Crow race ceased temporarily. On stage 4 of the other shore, many souls of light moved back and forth through the temple of the Bearing race. The ruins needed to be cleaned up while the collapsed beams needed to be rebuilt. For the souls of light in the Lust world, this was a very laborious project. As he returned to the other shore with his body again, Zen headed to the temple of the Oneness Sky Palace. He wanted to get a space ring from that Thunder Beast. For many years, that Thunder Beast stayed in the Oneness Sky Palace's temple. It was a bit apprehensive of Zen as it might be its first time to see a human body. Nonetheless, the thunder beast lowered its head and stretched out its tentacles when Zen extended his hand toward it. It proceeded to make a carving around Zen's fingers. Gradually, a shining square formed at Zen's fingertips. Just as it was about to be completely formed, it suddenly broke like a glazed tile with a sound of bang. Woo! For a moment, the thunder beast appeared stunned. It never expected this to happen. Zen was also shocked as he stared at his fingertips. He had never thought that the thunder beast could fail. Please do it again, Zen implored. The thunder beast complied. It repeated the process for the second time, but as soon as the space ring was almost formed, it broke again. Woo! The thunder beast shook its head and now refused to make a space ring for Zen the third time. Zen's face was filled with disappointment. He turned his head and spoke to Dorothy. It seems like the physical body is unable to get a space ring here. Dorothy seemed relieved as she smiled and said, your body is invincible on the other shore. If you have a Sumeru space, I'm afraid all of the good things here would be collected by you alone. In reality, Dorothy was happy about this. She was the only one who knew Zen's secret on the other shore. Zen needed her help in order to transfer those things he got on the other shore to his soul of light. So if Zen had gotten the space ring successfully, he would not need her help anymore. Hence, she would be useless to him. Chapter 2833, Ancestral Glory Stage. Zen naturally failed to decipher what was going on in Dorothy's mind. After he switched his form from his physical body to his soul of light to enter the other shore, he left the temple with Dorothy and headed for that square not far away. On that square, there was a star ring. It continued to emit coldness that was chilling to the bone. Around the star ring, many people sat with their legs crossed. They wanted to attempt at increasing their resistance against the cold. There were many ways to improve cultivation. The privileged super forces had reserves of soul crystal, and they would absorb it to increase their cultivation of soul of light faster compared to others. But the common folk in the source world had no qualifications to enter the temples, let alone to get any soul crystal. So they had to make use of other ways to improve cultivation that were less effective, such as enduring the brutal cold exuded by the star ring. Since Dorothy and Zen both had indigo souls, they inevitably attracted a lot of attention as they approached the scene. The indigo soul was invincible in stage 4 since it could reach stage 13 of the other shore directly. As a result, Zen and Dorothy were much more compelling than the others present there. Let's go. Dorothy gestured Zen to follow after her, and then she stepped into the star ring without any hesitation. As the star ring began to spin around her, her soul of light stretched up vertically and turned into a ray of light. With a swift movement, it shot up towards the sky, like a rising comet. After Dorothy ascended, it was Zen's turn. He entered the star ring to follow after her. Recalling back to when he first entered stage 4, he remembered how hard it was for him to bear the pressure exerted by the same star ring. However, that was a while ago, and his soul of light had made substantial progress since then. The coldness contained in the star ring could not harm him anymore. Whoosh! Within a split second, Zen had also successfully left stage 4. Just as they left stage 4, a soul of light slowly condensed and formed in the square where they once stood. It was the first time this soul had reached stage 4. Naturally, he was curious about exploring his surroundings. He glanced around to see if he could find anything worth his interest, and then he walked over to the side of the star ring. Upon noticing a warrior, he approached him and asked curiously, "Hey man, what are you guys doing here?" The cultivator looked annoyed by his question. He glanced at him and answered impatiently, "Are you blind? We are cultivating here." "What, really?" The man turned around and scanned the star ring with a baffled expression. The principles of this cultivation method were not hard to understand. Suddenly, he began to chuckle in amusement and said, "This cultivation method is equivalent to ants crawling on the ground, it's too slow. I heard that the super forces had built temples in stage 4. Why don't you guys go there?" Hearing his suggestion, the cultivator fell into a crippling depression. He wasn't a disciple of a noble race, which was why he didn't have the qualification to enter any of the temples. Did this man only come here to make him feel inferior and provoke him? It's none of your business. Leave me alone. The cultivator frantically waved his hands to drive the irritable man away. It's none of my business. How disrespectful. No one dared to talk to me like that in stage 3. Offended by the cultivator's attitude, the man reached for his arm and gently scratched at it. As a result of this action, the cultivator's arm immediately left his torso. The man grabbed it and swallowed it down. This man could directly devour other people's souls of light. What was even more shocking was that the warrior remained seated in cultivation as if he didn't sense his arm being pulled off. However, when he glanced in the direction of the man to see what he was eating, he saw it was his arm. You can directly swallow other people's souls of light. As feelings of terror filled the cultivator, he struggled with the right words to say. What's so strange about this? The creatures in stage 2 and stage 3 were too weak, so I came to stage 4. This place. I don't like to swallow the souls of light of my race, but I have no choice. It seems that there are only humans in this stage. The man replied, seeming unapologetic for his actions. Of course, stage 4 wasn't filled with humans only. But since they belonged to the same race, they would usually fly upwards in the same direction and land at the same location. What is wrong with you? You're crazy, the cultivator shrieked in horror. Then he turned into a blur and immediately retreated from the other shore. That man can actually devour souls of light. Isn't he afraid of the consequences? This guy is crazy. Other cultivators in the square began to scream in shock after witnessing that horrific scene. Each soul had its own will and could not devour each other. If one devoured too many other souls, it would be overwhelmed by them and would lose control of its will. Absorbing soul crystal was also like swallowing other souls. However, the soul crystal was not accumulated in a short time, and it was quite pure and free of such risks. Buzz. In the blink of an eye, all the souls of light in the square emptied their spots. They left out of fear of being devoured by this man. The man looked at the empty square in disappointment and sighed, I've said that I don't really like to devour the soul of my race. I just wanted to know how it tasted here. It seems that stage 4 is also nothing special. He didn't bother to stop the cultivators from deserting the area. In his eyes, they were similar to insignificant ants. There was an abundance of souls of light in the other shore. Everyone in the source world would have their soul of light step onto the other shore once reaching the other shore realm. In addition to humans, it also harbored myriads of non-human creatures. It only took the man a few days to move from stage 1 to stage 4 by swallowing the souls of light of other beings. While he stood still, he narrowed his eyes to look further in the distance. Soon, his gaze fell on a temple where disciples of the bearing race were busy with their work. A curious look appeared on his face. I've heard that the temples keep the purest soul crystal within them. I wonder if they would give me some if I asked. He always did what came to his mind, nothing was stopping him this time either. With quick steps, he made his way towards the temple. Meanwhile, Zen felt his soul take shape again. When he opened his eyes, he found he had reached stage 5, the primary light stage. This stage was different from stage 4. It was fully painted in white with the ground covered in layers of salt. Is it always so quiet in stage 5? Zen asked while looking around curiously. Dorothy nodded her head and explained to him, most races regard stage 4 as a starting point. So stage 5 is naturally neglected. No one would stay here, unless they want to explore some unique temples. The other shore tokens of stage 5 were not much different from those in stage 4. Moreover, those from major forces managed to obtain other shore tokens from higher stages in their temples, so there was no point in exploring stage 5. The same could be said about stages 6 and 7. Zen and Dorothy didn't stay there for long. They entered another star ring and continued to ascend to the next stage. Stage 6, the 7 brilliance stage, was a little dangerous and had a complex landscape. It was covered with giant rocks painted in a bright red color. On the other hand, stage 7, the nothingness stage, was occupied by pink fern. It proved refreshing in contrast to the previous stages. Stage 8, the great ultimate stage, seemed more like a world of only ice and snow. Stage 9, the red sun stage, like its name, was similar to that of a blazing sun with high temperatures. Stage 10 was called the mysterious light stage. The pair kept stepping into star rings of the stages and flying upward. As they ascended, they felt the pressure of the star rings increase gradually. For an ordinary person with an average soul of light, it would take a few years or even longer in the ascension. However, they were indigo souls. They could resist the pressure with ease. They kept progressing without a hitch. Finally, they reached stage 11, the ancestral glory stage. Dozens of giant souls of light appeared not far from them once they showed up in stage 11. These blurry souls of light looked terrifying, judging from the aura they emitted. Behind Zen, there were countless star rings. No one could tell exactly how many they were. Humans, come this way. A tall and seemingly powerful soul of light walked up to Zen and Dorothy and pointed to the right while giving the order. Chapter 2834, Rip Off. Zen's eyes filled with confusion, his gaze switching from the star rings to the non-human creatures stationed there. The origin of the star ring was unknown to him. All he knew was that it served as a key item for a warrior's ascension to the upper stages. According to what he had observed, one star ring was shared among all creatures of a particular race. For instance, despite the existence of a large number of star rings in stage 1, the human race could only rely on one to ascend to the next stage. This was the case for all the following stages. All the humans used the same rings to ascend. All races had their own star rings, and the star ring that belonged to the human race would normally be surrounded by humans, while those that belonged to the non-human races would likewise be surrounded by non-human creatures. However, the scene in front of him right now was entirely different from what he initially thought. For one, there were countless star rings piled high before him, and two, he was being ordered around by these non-human creatures as if they owned the place. Dorothy pulled his sleeve and whispered to him, "Just do as they say." She knew significantly more about the other shore, so Zen chose to follow her advice, albeit with a noticeable frown on his face. He returned his gaze onto the star rings. They had been arranged in an orderly fashion. Meanwhile, hundreds of souls of light gathered nearby and were lining up in two, neat queues. The road on your left will lead you towards the upper stage, while the one on your right will lead you to the temples. Choose one and line up. A tall, non-human creature announced in a loud voice. A collection of various creatures immediately followed. Small ear mice, giant beasts, and others, all lined up to form orderly queues. "What's going on?" Zen asked Dorothy in a low voice after they joined a long line. "This stage 11 feels different from the previous stages. It's because the Ancestral Glory stage is controlled by the Separate Abyss race," she explained. The Separate Abyss race was considered one of the strongest powerhouses in the Source world. Superior in terms of both soul and strength levels, they proved to be a force that the human race found difficulty in contending with. Zen's eyes widened in shock upon hearing this piece of information. A race can control an entire stage. This is a special case. The Separate Abyss race is closely related to a race on the other shore, so they got a bit of help from them in taking over this stage. Any super force that comes here would have to follow their rules, Dorothy told him. "What are the rules?" Zen asked. "Well, anyone who wants to pass through this Ancestral Glory stage and reach stage 12 has to pay 10,000 soul pills. And we need to line up for our turn," she explained. Zen turned to her with an intrigued look. "We have to pay? What if I leave stage 12 and go down through here? Would I still have to pay?" Dorothy nodded. Yeah, she definitely knew some stuff about stage 11, but this was actually her first time coming here. As a matter of fact, paying 10,000 soul pills was only to gain entry into the stage. If one wanted to explore, then they would need to pay an additional amount. Most souls of light would travel up and down in the Lust world, and the Separate Abyss race would charge everyone who passed this stage 10,000 soul pills as the toll. Isn't this robbery? What about the other large races in the Source world? Are they fine with this? Zen asked with evident concern. 10,000 soul pills were nothing to an indigo soul, but that cost could pile up since it had to be paid every time they passed through here. A non-human stranger snorted upon hearing his question. The Separate Abyss race is really powerful, and there's no way any other super force would be able to go against them. Besides, the cost is fairly reasonable, so everyone just chooses to pay rather than causes conflict. The stranger had a similar appearance to that of humans, except for the fact that he was much shorter and had several sharp thorns on his head. Zen had no idea which race he came from, but it seemed that he spoke the human language fluently. Dorothy nodded in agreement with the stranger's words. "That's basically it. No wonder Emily told me that humans weren't powerful here in the Source world." Zen muttered to himself, feeling a bit bothered by this new information he had just learned. To him, the Oneness Sky Palace, the Bearing race, and the Divine Farmer race were super powerful. However, not even these three super forces combined could dream of monopolizing an entire stage. Zen couldn't help but begin to fathom just how powerful the Separate Abyss race was to have been able to do such a feat. Zen and Dorothy waited for nearly an hour. Their turn was just about to come up when they heard a bit of a commotion up ahead. It seemed someone was begging for entrance. "I only have 8,000 soul pills, sir. Could you please make an exception and let me pass?" The voice belonged to a human woman, very young judging from her childish tone. "A human, Don't you know the rules around here? 10,000 pills isn't that much. If you don't have enough, then you can go ahead and work over there," a Separate Abyss member guarding the place answered in spite, pointing towards the west. The Separate Abyss race had fully occupied stage 11. They had already staked their claim, erected their temples, and were actually in the process of building a grand home for them to stay in. Construction on the other shore was laborious. Zen remembered the Bering race's temple he destroyed and figured that repairing it was going to be extremely difficult and would definitely take a long time. Since the separate abyss race wanted to build, then they would definitely need a lot of laborers. The girl's lips trembled in fear when she saw the direction the guard had pointed to. Everyone knew that working under the separate abyss race entailed certain dangers, one of them death. There was no way she would willingly go there if she valued her life. I give up. I won't go up. I'll just go back to stage 10. She exclaimed, tears brimming her eyes from disappointment. Of course you can go back to stage 10. But you'll still have to pay 10,000 soul pills if you want to leave. The guard laughed cruelly, relishing in the devastated look that flashed upon the human girl's face. It's 10,000 to go up, and another 10,000 to go down. That's the rule here. Ha ha ha. Several more separate abyss members joined in, laughing at the human girl and her suffering. Faced with such a hopeless situation, the human girl could only turn to others for help. She immediately began asking those lined up if they had 2,000 soul pills to spare. She'd pay them back when she reached stage 12. She promised. Unfortunately, the ones around her were all non-human creatures. Why in the world would they help her? In the end, she was left all alone. Then, can I leave first and pay the debt later when I earn enough soul pills? She asked in a soft, timid tone. Either pay 10,000 soul pills or go over there to work for it, girl. The guard snapped. With no more options left, the human girl stood there for a while before eventually walking towards the west. It was at this time that Zen decided to step out of his spot in line. He went towards her and nodded to the separate abyss guard up front. It's only 2,000 soul pills. I'll pay for her. His words shocked the human girl. She couldn't believe some stranger would be kind enough to help her out of this hopeless situation. It was a miracle. Thank you. When I reach stage 12, I promise I'll pay you back. Zen, however, shook his head. No need. He took out 2,000 soul pills from his space ring and was about to give them to the guard. However, the guard merely laughed at Zen. Boy, if you really want to help her then it'll cost you more than 2,000. Zen frowned. How much would it cost? 100,000 soul pills. The guard declared. Zen's face immediately darkened. These separate abyss members were truly determined to rip him off. True, he had managed to acquire a lot of soul crystal from the Bering race which made him very rich. A finger-sized chunk of soul crystal could be sold for a massive amount of soul pills and a mere 100,000 wasn't going to cause a dent in his fortune. What he didn't like though, was how thick-skinned the separate abyss race were in their dealings. Isn't it that everyone only has to pay 10,000 soul pills? Zen asked in a clipped tone. Ha ha. The guard laughed, clearly mocking Zen. This is our place and you have to give whatever amount we ask. You want to stand up for your fellow human, then I say that both of you now have to pay 100,000 soul pills. The bystanders waiting in line could only shake their heads. This was the exact reason why nobody was willing to help the human girl earlier. Dealing with the domineering separate abyss race was incredibly complicated and could end up biting them in the rear if they ever so much as offended them. Chapter 2835, Too Greedy. The exorbitant price required by the separate abyss race depressed the human girl as she could not afford it. She was afraid that she couldn't leave this stage today. Most people minded their business and would not meddle in others' affairs. She was, thus, grateful that Zen was willing to help her. Nevertheless, 200,000 soul pills were simply too much. Fine, the girl gritted her teeth as she muttered, I'll work for you. Although she knew it was dangerous, she had no other choice. At this time, Zen said, I will pay 200,000 soul pills. The separate abyss race always charged at will. What was worse, they increased the price randomly. Before the guards could change their minds, Zen nodded at Dorothy. Dorothy had been watching silently. When Zen nodded at her, she took 100,000 soul pills out of her space ring and offered it to the guards of the separate abyss race. The human girl's eyes opened wide. Even though they didn't know each other, Zen paid such a significant sum to get her out of trouble. She was surprised and extremely grateful. The separate abyss race, on the other hand, had been cunning as always. When Zen had stepped in to help the girl, they had increased the price tenfold and asked for 200,000 soul pills. Nevertheless, Zen still paid that amount. The separate abyss guards hadn't expected Zen to take out 200,000 soul pills. If they were to make things difficult for them now, it would ruin their race's reputation. Therefore, the leader of them waved his hand and said, You can go. The human girl walked up to Zen and said, I'll wait for you in stage 12. Thank you for your help. I will find a way to repay you. 200,000 soul pills were not a significant amount for any souls of light who could enter stage 12 or stage 13. But it was an exorbitant amount for the girl as her clan had declined. As she wasn't sure whether she could acquire 200,000 soul pills, she was hesitant to make the promise. Never mind all that, you can fly upward now, Zen said with a smile. As she was a stranger who he had met by chance on the other shore, Zen didn't think he would see her again in stage 12. Even though he knew that she couldn't return the soul pills, Zen had still helped her. The human girl nodded and walked toward the star ring. Zen and Dorothy waited in line for a while before it was finally their turn. According to the previous agreement, Zen paid 100,000 soul pills. But the guard of the separate abyss race pointed his huge finger at Dorothy and said, "You, 1 million soul pills." Dorothy's eyebrows shot up, and she asked, "Why? You paid 200,000 soul pills for him just now. It is fair to ask you to pay a higher price," the guard said with a sneer. "If you can't afford it, go that way." He sneered as he pointed to the west. Buzz. Enraged, Zen's soul of light exuded powerful soul aura. Even the alien races who were waiting in line felt that the separate abyss race was too greedy. They are greedy bullies. That's what happens when you help others. If you want to pass stage 11, you have to obey them. The other races whispered amongst themselves. They could tell that these two humans were in trouble. "What, do you have a problem with that?" The guards of the separate abyss race glared at Zen. They didn't take him seriously. Never before in the history of the separate abyss race had anyone dared to start a fight in stage 11. Dorothy could feel Zen's anger, but she didn't want to cause more trouble. She quickly interjected, "I don't have 1,000,000 soul pills. Can I pay with soul crystal?" The eyes of the guards of the separate abyss race lit up as soul crystal was more valuable than soul pill. In fact, every race valued soul crystal. After all, even if you had soul pills and divine crystals, you would still be unable to exchange them for soul crystal, considering its rareness. It depends on how much soul crystal you are willing to pay. Ha ha, the guards of the separate abyss race laughed. As they decided who proceeded to the next stage, they used their authority to extort greater amounts. "A finger-sized chunk," Dorothy offered. "Deal," the guards of the separate abyss race agreed without hesitation. Everyone knew that soul pills could be slowly accumulated, but soul crystal was rarely seen. As they could find no way to buy some, one finger-sized chunk of soul crystal was more precious than 1,000,000 soul pills. Dorothy took out a finger-sized chunk of soul crystal from her space ring and handed it to the guard of the separate abyss race. The other races' eyes shone with greed at the sight of the soul crystal. This was the rarely seen soul crystal, and she had actually paid the fee for passing stage 11 with it. What a reckless waste. Suddenly, everyone present was curious about her background. Although they sighed with envy at the sight of the soul crystal, they cursed the separate abyss race. Judging from the situation, they believed that the separate abyss race was becoming greedier and greedier. "Let's go." Dorothy walked to Zen and tugged at his arm. She wanted to avoid trouble, but Zen was rooted to his spot. He wasn't going to allow some guards to extort such an unfair price from them. Seeing that Zen wasn't leaving, the guards of the separate abyss race grinned. "Human boy, if you don't want to leave, you can stay here forever. Settle your anger, please. Let's go," Dorothy pleaded with Zen. Since staying here would only cause more trouble, Dorothy was naturally a little anxious. Finally, Zen turned and followed Dorothy toward the star ring. As soon as their souls of light entered the star ring, they turned into 2 rays of light and flew to stage 12. The human girl had been watching the star ring all this while. She had been waiting for Zen in stage 12, just as she had promised him. She wanted to repay Zen as she owed him a big favor. But, first, she needed to know more about him, including his name. Buzz. As the 2 rays of light descended, Zen's and Dorothy's souls of light reached stage 12. "Sir, thank you." As soon as the human girl recognized Zen's aura, she rushed toward him. However, before she could say more, Zen turned his head and said to Dorothy, "Wait for me here." Before anyone could object, Zen had left the other shore. Dorothy's plea to stay safe and be careful echoed in the space as Zen's figure had already disappeared. She shook her head slightly. Had the separate abyss race accepted 200,000 soul pills only, this would never have happened. But they had been unreasonable when they demanded 1,000,000 soul pills. If she didn't have the soul crystal, she would have been left in stage 11. When the human girl saw Zen disappear, she was at a loss for what to do. She stood silently for a while before she asked Dorothy, "Miss, where has he gone?" Dorothy replied, "He'll be back soon." She knew that it wouldn't take Zen long to turn stage 11 upside down. "Oh, The human girl shuffled her feet. Then, I'll wait for him here. Why are you waiting for him? Dorothy asked as curiosity coursed through her. I want to know his name. I will return the soul pills to him, the girl explained. Dorothy smiled at the girl. You don't need to do that. For her and Zen, 200,000 soul pills were not a significant amount. She did pay a higher price of a finger-sized chunk of soul crystal as demanded by the separate abyss race, but that had nothing to do with this young human girl. As Dorothy was generous and open-minded, she didn't blame the little girl. No, I must return them to him. The girl was surprisingly persistent. Since Dorothy's patience had waned, she said slowly, I gave the soul pills on his behalf. Now, I'm telling you that I don't need you to pay me back. You can leave. Dorothy's words upset the human girl, and she walked away reluctantly. Chapter 2836, A Hundredfold. As soon as Zen arrived, in his corporeal form, at the Oneness Sky Palace's temple, he saw a group of disciples stationed at the entrance of the temple. They all had grim expressions on their faces. Zen quickly deduced that they were guarding against a strong enemy. What's the matter? He demanded, going straight up to one of the disciples. Although they didn't know who he was, they knew he had helped them before. Before you came, something serious happened, said the disciple, sounding frantic. Tell me quickly, did the Bering race come to make trouble again? Zen asked, looking around him for signs of danger. The great loss suffered by the Bering race should have taught them not to go against the Oneness Sky Palace. Could they have dared to make trouble again so soon after their recent failure? Or was this the work of another race? The disciple shook his head. There was a man, but he didn't belong to the Bering race. We don't know where he came from. He can devour the souls of others. A man who devours souls? Zen repeated, startled. Yes, the disciple sounded extremely upset. He wanted soul crystal, and when we refused, he swallowed one of our members. We had to retreat to the temple. The temple was protected by a variety of powerful restrictions. Apart from Zen, who could come and go as he pleased, even the strongest souls would be burnt to ashes. Then he left, Zen asked. He went to the Bering race. We think he went there for soul crystal too, the disciple answered. Soul crystal was very difficult to obtain. At the moment, there were a lot of elite disciples of the Bering race here, but they were busy rebuilding their destroyed temple. This meant that no restrictions were yet in place to protect them. And so the man attacked them, eating at least 7 souls before the rest of the members of the Bering race fled from the other shore completely. Once they were gone, the man went through the ruins of the Bering race's temple. However, he had come too late. The temple had already been plundered by Zen, and whatever valuables remained had also been taken away by the Bering race. He wasn't able to find anything useful. He refused to give up. He went next to the temple of the Divine Farmer race. But by then, word had reached them of the danger on the other shore, and the temple was heavily guarded. Indeed, in the battle that ensued, the disciples of the Divine Farmer race managed to lure him inside the temple and almost succeeded in killing him. The man managed to escape the temple. After hearing the story, Zen asked, so where is this person now? He has probably left the other shore. His power to devour souls is terrifying, but apart from that one ability his soul does not seem very strong. He is also alone. He will find it hard to stand against many elite disciples united against him. When the Bering race realized what had happened, they cooperated with the Divine Farmer race to send a few indigo souls to hunt him down. Unfortunately, they did not succeed in capturing or killing him, said the disciple. The power to devour souls. This world is so vast, so full of so many mysteries. Zen muttered to himself, deep in thought. That kind of power was formidable. It seemed their unknown enemy was not afraid of any kind of counterattack or adverse reaction from the souls he had devoured. This man's soul of light might not be very strong now, but if he kept on swallowing souls, his cultivation speed would probably not be much slower than that of a warrior absorbing soul crystal. Zen wondered how this man had obtained such a power. The silver lining was that at least their enemy didn't come from the Bering race or the Divine Farmer race. Better yet, he had apparently struck a severe blow against the Bering race. Since Zen had learned what he needed to know, he left the temple and headed straight to the Star Ring. Dorothy was still waiting for him in stage 12 of the other shore. On the way up, Zen didn't stop. He reached stage 10 in less than an hour. Soon after that, he stepped into the Star Ring again. Several members of the separate Abyss race stood on the square of stage 11. They had the task of driving the souls of light to the other side to wait in line. With a glimmer of light, Zen's body appeared in the center of the square. You, this way, one of the men shouted at Zen, coming closer to him. He was about to usher Zen into his proper place in the line when he noticed something strange. He stopped in his tracks, looking stunned. A corporeal body. It was clear that the members of the separate abyss race had never met a corporeal body here. Zen gave him an indifferent glance and walked past him. The square was full of members of the separate abyss race, as well as people of other races who were waiting in line. One by one, as they saw Zen and realized he had a corporeal body, their faces changed and became full of shock and suspicion. What is that? This guy doesn't seem to be a soul of light. Yes, it's simply a corporeal body. But how did he enter the other shore? What is he? Is he a ghost? In their eyes, ghosts referred to souls that had left bodies. To this group, a corporeal body on the other shore was at least as mysterious and terrifying as a ghost in the outside. Of course, Zen had no intention of waiting in line. He bypassed everyone and walked up to the group of people in front who seemed to be in charge. "Excuse me, what can I do for you?" asked one of the men as Zen drew closer. The man was a member of the separate abyss race, and seemed to be the leader here. Given their status in Stage 11, these members of the separate abyss race tended to have an arrogant attitude towards the new arrivals. Most of the others found them overbearing and supercilious. But Zen was unlike anyone they'd encountered here before. Faced with a corporeal body, they became polite and deferential. Zen scowled and spoke in a threatening voice, "Repay me 100-fold for the amount of soul pills you just took. You have charged me 1,000,000 soul pills, so you must return 100 million, otherwise, I fear this situation will not end well for you." The souls of light who were waiting in line watched the scene avidly. They felt puzzled at Zen's words. They had no idea what had happened before, but right now Zen's ultimatum was very clear. He was extorting soul pills from the separate abyss race. Within Stage 11 of the other shore, the separate abyss race was the most powerful, and they were the only ones who could blackmail other races. Especially here, no one dared to fight back. The separate abyss race had extorted soul pills from all the super forces and powerful people. It was rare that someone went against them. This stranger was daring. The members of the separate abyss race exchanged astonished glances with each other. The truth struck them like a blow. This man in front of them was the person who had just given them soul pills and soul crystal. The leader was silent for a moment, thinking hard. Then he said to Zen, "We apologize for failing to recognize you. If you want them back, we will return the soul crystal and the 200,000 soul pills you gave us." He turned to one of his companions. "Alberto, take out the soul crystal." He and the others who were in charge of the square didn't have a high position in the separate abyss race. They had made a mistake in extorting Zen. Should the leader and elders of the separate abyss race ever learn that they had been foolish enough to offend a person capable of coming to the other shore in corporeal form, they would be severely punished. They decided it would be best to avoid further trouble and just return everything to Zen. The souls of light waiting in line couldn't hide their pleasure at seeing the separate abyss race humbled. They who had always been so tough, who had always acted so superior, had finally met their match. Zen gave the members of the separate abyss race a cool glance. "No, 100 million soul pills, or 100 finger-sized chunks of soul crystal." The leader's face changed, and his companions looked worried. The souls of light who were watching couldn't help but feel uneasy too. What would happen if the separate abyss race couldn't meet the stranger's demands? They felt that something big was about to happen. The leader squared his shoulders and glared at Zen. "Are you joking? It's enough that we will return everything to you. Alberto, hand it over." Alberto stepped forward and gave the soul crystal to Zen. Zen grasped it in his hand, and squeezed hard. The soul crystal burst into pieces and splattered around. Some of the fragments shot into the souls of light in line, and they were extremely satisfied with this unexpected development. Without the space ring, Zen could not store soul crystal. And he did not intend to take this finger-sized chunk of soul crystal. At the waste of the soul crystal, the members of the separate abyss race groaned. Zen stared coldly at them. "Send 100 million soul pills to Stage 12. If there is even a single pill missing, I will raise the separate abyss race to the ground." Chapter 2837, The Abyss Spirit Race. Zen's statements had left everyone speechless. Most non-human creatures had pinned him to be crazy. They thought he had lost his mind. It was already a ridiculous thing for Zen to come over and blatantly demand 100 million soul pills from the separate abyss race. And now he continued to assert his dominance by stating he would raise the territory of the separate abyss race to the ground. Among the non-human creatures, there was a human. He originated from the divine farmer race. This man had gone all the way from Stage 4 to Stage 13. However, he had only been on the other shore for a short while. Therefore, he He hadn't witnessed the scene of Zen destroying the temple of the Bearing race before he came here. But he did hear from his clansmen about everything that had happened in Stage 4, including the fact that Zen could enter the other shore with his physical body. I didn't expect this brat to suddenly come to Stage 11. From the looks of it, the Separate Abyss race has offended him as well. Does he really plan to cause a scene in the Separate Abyss race? The Separate Abyss race was formidable. Their strength was not something to be underestimated. Even the Bearing race hesitated to provoke them. Anyone who stood and watched began to anticipate the likelihood of something interesting to happen. Upon hearing Zen's arrogant words, the leader of the guards laughed mockingly. "What did you say? You want to destroy our territory? Ha ha ha, what a joke." Initially, the Separate Abyss race wanted to come to a compromise with Zen on the issue at hand. After all, Zen was the only one who had arrived at the other shore with his physical body. They didn't want to offend him and cause too much trouble for either of them. If this matter escalated without coming to a conclusion, a rumor would spread that the Separate Abyss race had demanded an exorbitant price. This would result in a severe blow to their reputation. Now that the situation was getting out of hand, they realized the problem couldn't be solved peacefully. Therefore, they changed their attitudes. It's true that it's a remarkable thing to have a physical body on the other shore. Other races might be intimidated by you, but we're not afraid of you. I'd suggest that you move to Stage 12 if you know what's good for you. We share the same origin with the Abyss Spirit race of the Ancestral Glory stage. Your physical body is no threat to us. There were many creatures of different kinds living on the other shore. The strength and durability of beings increased with a higher stage. Naturally, the ones that lived on Stage 1 to Stage 4 were not much strong in comparison. Some creatures would even occupy restricted areas where no one else but themselves were allowed on the other shore. There was not much known about these races because they maintained a low profile. They would seldom communicate or interact with the Souls of Light. Similarly, the Souls of Light that roamed the other shore would never dare to enter their territories and trespass on them. However, the Abyss Spirit race from Stage 11 was an exception. The Separate Abyss race and the Abyss Spirit race enjoyed a healthy relationship. It was said that in the Middle Ages, the Separate Abyss race was not as powerful as they stood today. When the leader of the Separate Abyss race had entered Stage 11, he had come across the Abyss Spirit race by chance. After a few interactions, they became exceedingly acquainted with one another. Since the Abyss Spirit race regarded the Separate Abyss race as their allies, they supported them in all aspects of their growth in Stage 11. Due to their relentless assistance, the latter soon took control of Stage 11 on the other shore. It could be said that the Abyss Spirit race had made a significant contribution to their development. Oh, really? Is that so? With swift movements, Zen grabbed the arm of the man in front of him. The immense soul of light was weightless in Zen's grip, and he threw him straight onto the wide square area. Watching Zen launch a direct attack made some of the impulsive members of the Separate Abyss race charge forward to avenge their clansmen. Chaos ensued when the other races in the line saw this. They began to flee frantically in all directions like a flock of disturbed birds. Some people took it as a source of their entertainment, while others were worried since they got involved in the matter for no reason. However, neither of them could get out of this. There was no way to retreat from the other shore in this place. The members of the Separate Abyss race were massive in terms of size, and each of them was innate mighty warriors. Moreover, they cultivated under the watchful eyes of the Abyss Spirit race, who taught them to develop a unique soul method. It was a technique that allowed them to enhance their souls of light to an extended degree within a short amount of time. At the same time, several members of the Separate Abyss race dashed towards Zen to strike. Meanwhile, Zen stood there as he had to bear terrible soul pressure from all of them. Each of those members was equipped with a soul spear that they thrust at Zen mercilessly. However, they had underestimated the strength and resistance of Zen's physical body. Although they had increased their soul power substantially, a soul was still inferior to a body. Moreover, Zen's physical body was far more compelling than that of an average person. Boom, 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 boom. The soul spears that would usually cause immense damage were like wooden arrows in front of Zen. The moment they came in contact with his body, they cracked into many minuscule pieces. After a full round of countless attacks towards Zen, he remained tall on his feet completely unscathed. Realizing that their attacks had all gone to waste, the members of the Separate Abyss race opened their eyes wide in shock. Their leader felt an undeniable fear build up inside of him. "All right then, it's my turn now," Zen said as he cracked his knuckles to prepare himself to counterattack. He never was ruthless towards the people of his own race, he would show them mercy. When he destroyed the temple of the Bearing race, He had spared the lives of all humans. However, he didn't consider the members of the separate abyss race to be from his race. These intelligent beings were no different from beasts with violent tendencies. Swish! By stomping on the ground hard with his feet, Zen boosted himself upwards as fast as an arrow released from its bow. When he passed through a tall and mighty warrior of the separate abyss race, he gently pressed on his head. Swish! The man's soul of light diminished in an instant. However, Zen did not plan to stop there. He turned his head to find his next target and rushed towards a man close by. Within a split second, Zen had attacked 4 people and destroyed their souls of light. He's too strong for us. We can't fight against him. Hurry and inform the Abyss Spirit race. The remaining members of the separate Abyss race began to retreat and flee the field one after the other. But they had nowhere to go since the area was sealed shut. Zen stood patiently and didn't bother to follow after them to kill them off. After observing the panicked looks on the faces of other races, he turned to them and said, "Find your own star rings and leave this place." Without the obstruction of the separate Abyss race, they were able to leave stage 11 through the star rings. And they wouldn't have to pay the heavy fee of 10,000 soul pills. All the other races were grateful to Zen. He had helped them save 10,000 soul pills. And more importantly, he had taught the arrogant members of the separate Abyss race a good lesson. The separate Abyss race had kept their dominance over small and powerless races in stage 11 in the source world. It was about time someone showed up and put them in their place. "Thank you, sir. We are grateful to you for helping us. But you have to be careful with the Abyss Spirit race. Those living creatures on the other shore can also present themselves with their physical bodies. They are very powerful." Some people who knew a little about Zen's approaching enemy gave him all the information they had so he could prepare himself. Zen carefully listened to them and nodded. Then he made his way forward and scanned his surroundings. The separate Abyss race had built an entire city on the other shore, not just a temple. The city wall alone stood over 1,000 feet high, and the buildings within were at an astounding height of 10,000 feet. With careful steps, he walked over to the wall and gently pressed his hands against it. As he exerted a little pressure, the wall, which was 1,000 feet high and 100 feet wide, collapsed with a loud sound that reverberated far and wide. A noticeable gap was formed. The members of the separate Abyss race, who stood behind the wall, were oblivious to the scenario that took place on the other side. They eyed Zen up in astonishment. Chapter 2838, The Past Scare. What happened? Did the city wall collapse? Who was strong enough to destroy the wall? Was it the ghost-sneaking beast? Creatures in stage 12 of the other shore were not limited to those from the Abyss Spirit race and the separate Abyss race. It was also home to unique and powerful beasts, one of which was the ghost-sneaking beast. The souls of light in the 11th stage of the other shore realm were not strong enough to destroy the city wall, but the ghost-sneaking beast could. As usual, Zen, too, was an exception. He could easily destroy the city wall, which was why the separate Abyss race was astounded by his power. What's that? He seems to be a simple human. He's not in soul form. Unbelievable. Upon seeing Zen, members of the separate Abyss race gasped. They could not believe what they were seeing. Zen squinted as he walked. He remained completely unbothered by their reactions. He walked calmly and on his toes towards a huge building. Then he crashed into the pillars of the building. As he moved forward, the pillars broke into pieces. Members of the separate Abyss race hastily tried to approach Zen without considering the risks. "No matter which race you come from, you are courting death. No one has ever dared to go against us, especially not a mere human like you. Are you from the Bearing race?" Zen didn't want to waste any more time on them. For those who approached him boldly, Zen simply flicked his arm to smash their souls of light. He had killed several of their members and the separate Abyss race was quickly realizing how much of a threat he really was. But they did not give up. They did not leave the other shore. Despite Zen's display of strength, they gathered behind him and cursed him. They wanted to stop him but did not dare approach him. Then, they heard the sound of a rumble. Zen had passed through another huge building a moment before its collapse. He walked towards the center of the city, triggering the collapse of every building he passed by. Nothing could stop him. More and more members of the separate Abyss race followed behind Zen. Each time a building collapsed, their hearts sank deeper. "Hey, human, stop, take what you want." The place grew tense. These people were not figures of authority in the city. Zen had previously asked for 100 million soul pills, but they refused. They had to really see Zen's power before they bowed to his wishes. Zen ignored them profusely. He passed a wide road where a magnificent building stood. He remembered his reactions to those temples when he newly entered stage 4. He could not comprehend then how the human race was capable of such wonder. The building in front of him put him in even more awe. It was bigger than what he had seen before. What a beautiful building, Zen remarked. Members of the separate abyss race who trailed behind him trembled at his words. They did not want to lose anything to him anymore. What do you want to do? Someone of the separate abyss race asked. Zen had already destroyed the buildings in the outer part of the area, but they could not take it if he destroyed the building ahead of them. It was the real temple of the separate abyss race. I want to tear it down, Zen said nonchalantly. Then he casually walked towards the building. Stop him. Don't let him enter the temple. Nobody can desecrate our temple. Members of the separate abyss race furiously rushed towards Zen in an attempt to stop him. However, before they even got close, Zen shattered them instantly. The separate abyss race fell into despair. Would the temple really be destroyed by a young man? Suddenly, the sound of horns played in the distance. Woo woo woo. Suddenly, huge eagles filled the sky. They flew from outside of the city walls carrying giants on their backs. The giants bore a close resemblance to those from the separate abyss race, but the latter had blurred outlines because they were only souls of light. However, the giants' appearances were clearly visible. They were from the abyss spirit race that lived on the other shore. Great, the knights of the abyss spirit race are here. They're here to save us. Kill this human brat. Excitement stirred the place. The separate abyss race grew confident. Their backup finally arrived and they could smell victory coming their way. Splash! The eagles lined up and swooped towards Zen. The destruction of buildings was a capital offense both for the separate abyss race and the abyss spirit race. The abyss spirit race were definitely angered by Zen's disrespect. They were determined to kill him. Splash! As the abyss spirit knights neared Zen, they revealed white bone spears in their hands. Bone spears were known to be even more powerful than soul spears. Kill him! The abyss spirit knights shouted with conviction. How strong could these creatures from the other shore be? Zen squinted his eyes as if inspecting their features. He did not know much about the other shore even though he was a competent indigo soul now. In his long stay on the other shore, he had only encountered two types of aboriginal creatures. One was the heavenly spider's body in the sacred Mallow Temple, and the other was the thunder beast in the Temple of Oneness Sky Palace. For the first time, he encountered two creatures at the same time in the same place. One was the abyss spirit race, and the other was the flying eagles that they rode. Whoosh! A bone spear flew towards him but Zen was able to avoid it. He stretched out his hand and easily grabbed the spear. They seem strong, much powerful than souls of light. But they can't be strong enough to defeat me, Zen said scornfully. As soon as he grasped the bone spear, Zen pushed it out with his hand. The bone spear lashed in the air. It emitted a whistling sound as it landed directly on the chest of an abyss spirit knight. Bang! Blood spewed out of the body of the abyss spirit knight. He lost his balance and fell from the back of the eagle. His bleeding body lay crumpled on the ground. The eagle, disoriented from what happened, followed suit. It flapped its wings to carry itself up but failed. Zen grabbed another spear and threw it towards another abyss spirit knight rushing towards him. Bang! 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 Zen kept on throwing spears, each time hitting an abyss spirit knight right on the chest. Bodies fell from the sky and crushed on the ground. The abyss spirit race was indeed stronger than the souls of light, but they were only creatures of stage 11. This meant that Zen was still miles stronger in terms of pure physical strength. A total of 8 abyss spirit knights lay on the ground. The others panicked behind Zen, trying to force the eagles into flight. Suddenly, a look of terror dawned on the faces of the abyss spirit knights. Does he cultivate wild god power? Are we dealing with a wild god once more? No way. Rules have been changed. No wild god could enter the other shore. It has been like that for the past tens of millions of years. The abyss spirit knights exchanged frightened murmurs as they shared the memories of the time when they were dominated by wild gods. Chapter 2839, The Past. In ancient times, the warriors of the source world mainly cultivated the wild god system, and they used the ancient god cultivation method to enter the other shore. At that time, it was much easier to travel on the other shore. A wild god could become tens of thousands of feet tall. As the corporeal body was far stronger than the soul, warriors of the source world were immensely powerful when they entered the other shore with their real bodies. At that time, the creatures on the other shore, who were at a significant disadvantage, were easily slaughtered by the wild gods. A race like them could only hide in a corner of the ancestral glory stage. Every time the wild gods plundered the other shore, it was disastrous for the whole abyss spirit race. At one point, the wild gods had almost annihilated the abyss spirit race. Everything happened at that time was like a nightmare. This was indeed a dark period for the Abyss spirit race. After the decline of the cultivation method of the wild gods and changes in the truth rules, the creatures on the other shore earned a gradual respite. This reprieve allowed struggling races, like the Abyss spirit race, to pull through. Eventually, these creatures turned the tables and took the lead. Those who entered the other shore later were weak souls of light. Without their corporeal bodies, how could they possibly be a match for the creatures on the other shore? As a result, the races on the other shore took furious revenge for what they had endured. At that time, stages above stage 4 were death land for the powerful warriors of the other shore realm. They were extremely dangerous places, and any other shore realm warrior that entered would die because none could resist the attack of the races on the other shore. This was also the reason why most races had built their temples on stage 4. Although there were also other shore creatures that lived on stage 1 to stage 4, they hadn't formed any groups, and they wouldn't target the souls of light. Over time, the hatred the other shore creatures harbored for the Source World warriors gradually subsided. No one knew why. From the Middle Ages until now, the other shore creatures and the souls of light had managed to coexist peacefully. Some of the large races even chose to form alliances with the races on the other shore. The Abyss spirit race and the separate Abyss race, for example, were connected by blood, and thus, naturally associated. After the few separate Abyss members, who had extorted soul pills from warriors passing through stage 11, fled, the matter was reported to the senior leaders of their race. These senior leaders quickly communicated with the Abyss spirit race, who then sent Abyss spirit knights to confront Zen before he could destroy the temple of the separate Abyss race. These Abyss spirit knights were almost invincible. Although their cultivation was not extraordinary, the souls of light in the lust world could not resist them at all. Unfortunately for these Abyss spirit knights, they had no idea that they were about to deal with a corporeal body. Naturally, what they saw before their eyes alarmed them. The fear hidden deep within their hearts erupted and coursed through them like an unstoppable force. Those who had survived the Dark Ages would never want that history to repeat itself. And people who had heard about the dark times would always be seized by terror whenever they thought about it. If warriors could enter the other shore with their corporeal bodies again, it would undoubtedly mean the return of the darkness. Wild God. A playful smile appeared on Zen's face. In the entire chaos, perhaps only those living at the bottom of the chaos cultivated the wild god system. However, none of them could use the ancient god cultivation method to enter the other shore. Zen had not tried to activate his wild body after he arrived on the other shore. He said to the Abyss Spirit Knights, "Is this the wild god you were discussing?" Then, his body began to grow. In a flash, his body reached over 10,000 feet in height. Even the Abyss Spirit Knights who were sitting on the back of the eagles needed to look up at him. They paled and the flying eagles became restless at the sight of Zen's enlarged body. He really cultivates the wild god system. I heard about the wild gods from my grandfather, but I didn't expect him to grow to such a massive size. He is probably over 10,000 tall, isn't he? The Abyss Spirit Knights present stared at Zen with their mouths wide open. Even the large number of souls of light from the separate Abyss race, who were in the city, gaped at Zen. When the Abyss Spirit Knights arrived, it boosted the morale of the separate Abyss race. The souls of light of the separate Abyss race in the city had often heard about the powerful strength of the Abyss Spirit Knights, but none had ever seen it. Over the years, no one had dared to make trouble on stage 11. Even if someone caused trouble, it was not serious enough to alert the Abyss Spirit Knights. Who would have thought that such a powerful team of Abyss Spirit Knights would be so weak in front of Zen? They were all depressed, shocked, and confused when they saw Zen's body expand to such a degree in the blink of an eye. The souls of light exuded an aura of fear, and the more cowardly ones retreated from the other shore. But most of them were reluctant to leave. Oh, dear, did fate send him to wipe out our separate Abyss race? We, the separate Abyss race, have occupied stage 11 for many years. Is this the end of our happy days? It seems that our temple might be destroyed today. In the corner of this large city, the soul of light of the separate Abyss race, who had blackmailed Zen, trembled when he saw Zen's colossal body. It was only now that he understood where Zen's confidence came from, and he was regretful for what he had done before. 100 million soul pills is not an exorbitant amount to pay to make him leave. 100 million soul pills. Give them to him. The soul of light muttered as he rushed into the temple. He was so terrorized by fear that he was already out of his mind. On the square outside the city, many non-human creatures also saw the giant figure rising on the horizon. Zen's body was so enormous that it would be difficult for them not to notice him. That is a human. He seems familiar. Could it be the man who was here just now? How did this person become so huge? Although these non-human creatures knew that Zen wanted to make trouble for the separate abyss race, they never expected that he would use such an incredible way. Currently, the temple only reached Zen's calf. It seemed as though he could trample an entire temple just by lifting his leg. While the thought terrified everyone, only Zen knew that he wasn't capable of such damage. Although he had absorbed a large number of wild bones, the limit his body could grow into was far more than 10,000 feet high. However, the wild god power was incomparable to the other shore power. After all, the wild gods corresponded to true gods, and when Zen was just a consummate true god, the force he could unleash with his full strength was only 1 divine megaton. As the ancient wild gods, who had used the ancient god cultivation method to enter the other shore, cultivated truth of powerful holy body, they were able to merge with other shore tokens. However, Zen was special as he hadn't cultivated the truth of powerful holy body. And so, he didn't know whether his body could merge with other shore tokens, or if it could, how he should go about it. Just then, 3 more eagles flew toward Zen from outside the city. 3 elders of the abyss spirit race were on the backs of these flying eagles. They had lived for a very long time, as evident from their shrunken sizes. They were pygmies when compared with the abyss spirit knights. The 3 old men hovered in front of Zen. The white-haired old man at the helm asked, "Human boy, why do you destroy our city and temple for no reason?" Zen sneered, "Ask the separate abyss race. They forced a human to pay 1 million soul pills to pass stage 11. How could you say that I have no reason?" Chapter 2840, Reach and Compromise. Zen's thunderous voice shook the souls of light to the core. His words shocked everyone, especially the 3 old men from the abyss spirit race. The 3 did not show it, but what just happened made them worry greatly. If Zen came here to make trouble for no reason, then they would be in great trouble. However, if he had some reason to do what he did, things would be different because that meant that they had a chance of negotiating with him. The leader of the 3 old men bowed respectfully to Zen. "My friend, please calm down and wait a moment. I shall go and ask the separate abyss race regarding this matter." With this, the eagle beneath his feet let out a shrill cry before descending towards the temple. There was a bit of a 5-minute wait before the old man returned, still atop the eagle, and faced Zen. "I apologize for what the members of the separate abyss race did. They were the ones who broke the rules and inconvenienced you. As compensation, we will be giving you 100 million soul pills." That amount might seem like a terrible loss at first, but they could easily earn it back. 100 million soul pills was just the toll fee of 10,000 creatures after all. Zen's rampage in the city cost no less than 100 million soul pills, but it was important to placate him now, or they would risk paying a bigger price if he continued his destructive ways. What the old man was worried about was the possibility of Zen going back on his word. "Send 100 finger-sized chunks of soul crystal instead of 100 million soul pills to the human race's star ring in stage 12, Zen ordered. Given his reasonable demand, the 3 old men of the abyss spirit race raised no more objections against him. Once an agreement had been reached, Zen finally shrank back to his normal size. With this problem taken care of, the young man turned away to take his leave. The old man of the abyss spirit race, however, stopped him. "My friend." Zen turned around, an eyebrow raised in suspicion. "What is it?" The old man hesitated for a brief moment but went ahead to ask his question. "As far as I know, the body refining skill of the ancient gods has long since lost its effect and no real body could enter the other shore. Just how were you able to enter with that body of yours?" Truth ruled the whole chaos. It was greater than everything and the old man believed that it was also unbreakable. Zen's existence right now was an enigma. How exactly did this young man do it? The only explanation the old man could think of was that Zen surpassed the truth, but that was impossible. Surpassing the truth would mean that he was stronger than the chaos ancient gods and there was no way that was the case given his cultivation base. I don't know either. Even if I did, why should I tell you?" Zen answered coyly. His reply had the old man blush in embarrassment. Since the young man was unwilling to disclose his secret, then all they could really do was let him leave quietly. Numerous members of the separate abyss race lined the road that led out of the city. Almost all of them stared at Zen in fear as he walked past. None of them knew of the fact that they weren't the first ones to suffer his wrath. The Bering race had previously tasted the bitter consequences of angering this human man. Outside the city, Zen stepped into the human race's star ring and immediately entered stage 12. Dorothy had been waiting for him for quite a while now. She immediately heaved a sigh of relief upon seeing him finally walk out of the star ring. Going against the separate Abyss race was an entirely different can of worms compared to when Zen went against the Bering race. The main reason was that the separate Abyss race was backed by the Abyss Spirit race who were natives of the other shore. How did it go? Dorothy asked, hiding her worries with a nonchalant greeting. It went fine. We should wait here for a moment, Zen told her. Why? Dorothy asked. Zen smirked. 100 finger-sized chunks of soul crystal. Dorothy let out a slight gasp. You seriously made them pay you back with 100 finger-sized chunks of soul crystal? And they said yes. Did you demolish their entire temple or something? She was well aware of how arrogant and domineering the separate Abyss race was. For Zen to have made them agree to his terms and pay him back meant he probably caused great damage to their temple. Zen shrugged. Kind of. We came to an agreement before I managed to destroy their temple. Dorothy was no fool. No matter how casual Zen made it out to be, she knew that he caused a great deal of devastation to the separate Abyss race for things to have turned out this way. It's as Grandma said, once Zen passed the sea of truth in the form of his body, he can do whatever he wants on the other shore. He's already demolished the Bering race's temple, and almost destroyed the separate Abyss races. He's truly leaving a trail of destruction in his wake, isn't he? She thought to herself. The two of them waited for 2 more hours before a soul of light appeared and immediately headed towards Zen. There was only one corporeal body here on the other shore which made identifying Zen quite easy. I've been entrusted by the separate Abyss race to hand you the agreed settlement, the soul of light told Zen politely, taking out small pillars from his space ring. These were the 100 finger-sized chunks of soul crystal. Zen accepted these pillars and casually threw them to Dorothy. He nodded back to the soul of light in front of him. They gave you these. Weren't they scared you'd run away with the soul crystal or something? The courier laughed. You've got quite the sense of humor, sir. My corporeal body is in the separate Abyss race. How in the world would I be able to run away? Zen shrugged and figured that it made sense. The separate Abyss race was a super force, so there was a huge possibility that they would have a number of warriors from other races serving them. Since the soul crystal had been delivered, the courier stepped back into the star ring and returned to stage 11. Zen's body left the other shore and his soul of light returned. He had no intention of staying at stage 12 for too long. Instead, he entered the star ring and continued straight to stage 13. Stage 13, also known as the ethereal glorious stage, was the last and most important stage of the Lust world. Most souls of light stayed here in search of the most suitable other shore tokens. The ethereal glorious stage never disappointed. Even until now, this stage continued to hold a lot of unveiled secrets and unexplored temples. Unfortunately, its splendor was countered by how dangerous it was. 6 or 7 native races lived in this stage along with other strong and dangerous creatures that still hadn't formed their own tribe. It was easily the most perilous stage in the entire Lust world. Several great forces had made numerous attempts to control the ethereal glorious stage, much like how the separate Abyss race managed to gain control of stage 11. However, all of them failed. The natives of this stage fought with each other quite violently, so there was no way the souls of light from the source world could come in and take control. When Zen reached stage 13, he was a bit taken aback to how different it was from what he initially imagined. I thought stage 13 would be desolate. I didn't expect it to be quite a busy place. Star rings from all races were strewn about here and there. What was most peculiar was the fact that despite the coexistence of all sorts of creatures, they got along rather harmoniously. Souls of light who had the ability to step into stage 13 were usually indigo souls or one step away from that realm. Elite disciples of all races from the source world gather here in stage 13. There are naturally more indigo souls here, Dorothy told him. Unlike Zen, she didn't seem that surprised at the scene before them despite the fact that this was her first time here. The two of them went past the randomly strewn star rings and headed south where they stumbled upon a one-floor building. Dorothy sighed with relief. It's here. No race ever built a temple in stage 13, instead, they constructed simple strongholds and the one in front of them was built by none other than the Oneness Sky Palace.